public session. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody to this afternoon's meeting of the Education Committee. So we'll just do the housekeeping as usual. So I would advise members that the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online, and I would advise those in the public gallery that they are welcome to use mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and that all devices are muted, and as usual it's not permitted to take photographs or record any part of the meeting. So item 1 then on the agenda is apologies. I don't have any apologies, and just to note that Cara will be joining online, so as usual, any issues with audio or connection, do just flag that up through the clerk and the team, but also just to ask if you make sure that you use the raise hand function to come in so that you do get picked up on that. And like Deputy Chair, you'd said you need to leave early today. Yes. Yeah, so the Deputy Chair will be stepping out a little earlier than usual. So item 2 then is Chairperson's business. Just a couple of items. So I would refer members to page 5 of their packs, and that's a report and the speaking notes from the informal meeting that the committee held with Linking Generations on the 1st of April. I would just want to sort of reflect first of all that I thought it was a really helpful briefing, and they are an organisation who are doing really some really great work, and I think the key takeaway for me was that it is very much cross-cutting work. It doesn't just sit within the educational space, although they do a lot of work with schools, and it was clear to them that they really feel that they have a role to play across a whole range of executive departments and across programme for government priorities as well. So look, I'm happy to hear from members in terms of any actions arising from it, but I mean I'll just be straightforward. It was very clear that they are in a challenging position in terms of their funding and resource, and that they are keen to be able to continue delivering that work. So on that basis, given certainly we heard some really positive stuff coming through around their work in schools, and that intergenerational work in schools and helping schools connect more widely with their communities, and a whole range of items of the curriculum that covers. I would want to suggest that we do write to the Education Minister to highlight the committee's support for the organisation and to ask whether he would be of a view and open to meeting with Lincoln Generations to discuss their positive contribution to education. I know that I think a similar request has been made of the Communities Minister, to which he has responded positively, so that would be a positive step. But I would want to suggest that our letter should highlight the fact that this crosses executive departments, and maybe ask the Minister if he would be able to suggest how his department can engage across the executive to ensure that the work of Lincoln Generations can be maximised, and particularly in terms of funding opportunities. So those would be my initial thoughts. Happy to open up to members for anyone who attended the session if there's any views. Are we agreed on that proposal then? Agreed? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I then also refer members to page 8 of their packs, and that's an Assembly Research and Information Service paper on generative artificial intelligence in the education system. Again, happy to open that up to members for any views on any actions arising from that. I would propose we note at this stage, but if members are keen to seek briefings on any aspect of that in the future, they can certainly raise that through the clerk. Any other contributions on that? Great. Okay, and then the only other bit at this on item 2, I think it would just be it would make sense to just reference the outcome of the teachers' pay dispute, which has taken place since we last met, and I think it's an issue that the committee has discussed a lot in terms of industrial relations in education. So I would certainly want to confirm my welcome of that pay deal being finally secured, and I'm sure members would want to join me in that. But I would want to propose also that the committee does write to the Minister to welcome that development. But I think given just how conscious we are and have been in our engagements on this issue of how crucial workload and addressing teacher workload is to actually getting this deal not just agreed but meaningfully delivered, I think it would be good to hear from the Minister to get a clear breakdown of the actions that are now being progressed to address workload, including the timelines for delivery, and I think with the independent review of workload that was announced, something around the scope and the timelines for that specifically. So are members agreed, or any other contributions? Peter?
Yep, thank you very much, Chair. No, I think it would be definitely worth doing that. I certainly want to put on record my thanks to both the Minister and the unions in terms of the work that they engaged in getting to this point. I think it will be incredibly beneficial for our children. I think action short of strike or strike is problematic for education in Northern Ireland, and so I think both sides worked really hard to get to a resolution. Both sides should be commended. I'm really glad we are where we are in terms of teachers getting the proper pay for the work that they do, that there is this commitment around the workload issues, and I'm content that we send a letter along those lines to the Minister.
Thank you. No other indications. I think we're agreed on that. We obviously left it in true Northern Irish political fashion to the 11th hour to get the deal agreed, but we did get there, which was welcome. So item 3 then, that's declaration of interests. I would want to just note a specific interest on this agenda with the briefing from the Controlled Schools Task Force. I am a governor on a controlled primary school, so I should just note that. Any other declarations of interest? Colin?
Madam Chair.
Same. And
My wife is a governor of Control School.
No other declarations. Okay. That's all noted. Item 4 is matters arising. Don't have anything to note unless any members wish to raise anything. Nope. That takes us to item 5 then, which is draft minutes. So I would refer members to the minutes of the committee meeting, the draft minutes of the committee meeting 2nd of April at page 59, and I would be seeking members' agreement that the minutes are a complete and accurate record of proceedings. Is that agreed?
Right.
Agreed. Okay. I have a copy of those. Okay, so item 6. So members, that is our first briefing of the session today, and it's a briefing from Sure Start. So I'd refer members, as the witnesses come through, to the briefing note from the committee clerk at page 68 and the briefing paper from Sure Start at page 69. So I'll just let the witnesses get seated and make themselves comfortable, and then we can make a start. Yes, you should have your name tags there for you, so hopefully everything's where it should be. So I'll let you all get seated. So just while witnesses are getting seated, we have with us today, and I'll let everybody do their introductions as well. We have Joy Poots, who's a member of Inner City South Belfast Sure Start, Mervyn Bell, Project Coordinator with Sure Start, Siobhan Meehan, Manager at Sure Start, and Tracy Whitley McElvogue, Project Coordinator at Sure Start. But I will let you all do your own introductions and correct any of those job titles that I'll inevitably I've got something wrong there. So we're really here, particularly as we have the department coming in today to brief us around early years and childcare. We thought it would be really appropriate to hear from a key stakeholder in advance of that, to understand your work, what it is that Sure Start delivers, and perhaps some of the challenges you might be facing in that space at the moment. So we would open it up to the floor really for an initial presentation of up to 10 minutes. And I would say that we are fairly tight for time, so it would be up to 10 minutes, and then we'll move into question and answer. And we usually try to keep it to around 5 minutes per inquiry for each member. So please, if I do come in and cut you short on your answers, please don't be offended. We ask just to keep things short and to the point, but to give every member a chance to come in. So you're very welcome, and it really is over to you at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much for the invite. We've been hoping to come for quite some time, so it's great to be here now today. I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves as I speak, to try and cut short. What I want to do is just a brief introduction really about Sure Start, the context of it in Northern Ireland. So the first 5 Sure Start programmes in Northern Ireland were established in 2001, so we're 24 years old, or at least some of the programmes. And that was actually 2 years later than the programme started to be introduced in England. And it was intense lobbying by the children's sector in Northern Ireland that actually forced the Assembly way back in those years to bring Sure Start into Northern Ireland. We actually, looking back, received the funding that was going into Sure Start in the early days was quite hefty. Northern Ireland would have received its unhypothecated consequentials for Sure Start, and we reckon about 50% of what came for Sure Start in Northern Ireland actually went to Sure Start. So that was where we started. And the programmes then were specifically for children aged 0 to 4 and their families living in the 20% most deprived areas, with the aims of improving health, improving the ability to learn, improving social and emotional development, and strengthening families and communities. And those aims are largely the same 24 years later, and the programme is largely the same. And every programme was to be developed and delivered on a partnership model. So, you know, there's a lot of talk in the early days about Sure Starts being partnerships, which they are still in format. It's just not talked about as much, involving the community, voluntary and statutory sectors and parents in local communities. And in 2007, there was a big change in that we moved from the Department of Health to the Department of Education. That was during a period of direct rule that happened. So now, as it stands, DE is the policy lead for Sure Start in Northern Ireland, and the SPPG unit of the Department of Health is the operational management. So it is a really a cross-departmental programme, probably unlike many others. In the almost 25 years since its inception, Sure Start has developed in two ways. Firstly, its reach. So since 2013, we're now up to 38 individual Sure Start programmes across Northern Ireland. And we cover about 42% of the super output areas of Northern Ireland. And those would be the most deprived super output areas mostly. And around 36,000 children aged 0 to 4 have access to, they fall into a Sure Start catchment area in that age group each year. The annual budget has also risen from originally, and I was saying back in 2001, I think it was 3.5 million, to now 33,672 last financial year. And the other way that you know Sure Start has changed in those 24 years is the expertise that has been built up within the project. And that is something that actually having that continuity has allowed to happen in so many ways. And continuity has been a big part of the success of Sure Start in Northern Ireland. We have a good balance of core services and measurement tools across Northern Ireland, and we still have that local autonomy, which means projects can be reflective of local needs and aspirations. So a Sure Start programme working in South Belfast Ram is maybe very different from one that's working in Downpatrick in its rural environments. We have a Northern Ireland-wide database that has the registration details of every family, and it logs every single interaction between children and parents with the Sure Start programme. So it's a huge resource that is sitting there, and actually it's a researcher's dream in some senses about early years intervention. Ongoing staff training is a big thing for us in Sure Start, and it enables programmes to be responsive to emerging needs and issues. So in 2018, thanks to the collaborative cross-departmental structure and our own lobbying, we secured our centralised referral system for maternity services to Sure Start. So we get around 6,500 pregnant women's details every year who have consented across the Sure Starts in Northern Ireland to be passed on to us. And antenatal services have therefore increased exponentially since then, and that supports the critical importance of the first 1,001 days. So it's tapped in, if you want to start this answer. However, Sure Start Northern Ireland is also a bit of a time capsule in that, unlike England, it hasn't changed substantially in its mission or delivery over almost 25 years. And it is this longevity and protection from the changing interests of successive governments that has actually allowed it to flourish, build and maintain credibility with the populations it serves, and makes real differences for the lives of families in the here and now, as well as the future trajectory for thousands of children in Northern Ireland each year. And that stability has fostered this continuous improvement and learning ethos within the organisation. The Institute of Fiscal Studies has been producing longitudinal reports on the impact of Sure Start in England, and in areas such as educational outcomes and health. And what it is finding in its research is that the first waves of Sure Start in Northern Ireland, which is what the Northern Ireland model is still to this day, had the most significant outcomes on the futures of children. So it turns out Northern Ireland was right for once. I'm going to pass over to Siobhan now, who will give you more information on the impacts of Sure Start in Northern Ireland, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions about any of that for members later. Thank you.
We're really glad and happy that we can have the opportunity to come and talk to you today about Chairperson Northern Ireland. I'm sure you're already aware of the highway reach and we're well recognised early intervention programme. Chairperson has a unique position in which it recognises regularly and particularly with academics and other government departments as a vehicle to support young citizens. Chairperson is an excellent example of how health and education can work jointly together. Chairperson works in a multidisciplinary and holistic model and is embedded in all of our communities and partnerships that already exist. We recently completed a parental survey, which Mervyn will show you later today, and 98% of the parents who completed that survey said that they would recommend Chairperson to family and friends. The 38 Chairperson projects in Northern Ireland play a vital role in helping and improving attaining and outcomes for our young people, particularly those from the less advantaged backgrounds. The Department of Education's Early Years Framework Learning to Learn identifies the Chairperson programme as one of the key early year interventions, initiatives and programmes importance in creating preschool experiences for our young children, looking at our social, emotional and cognitive development of our children. We currently run a developmental programme for 2-year-olds, which I'm sure you are all aware, and currently in that programme we have 48% of those children who are presenting with additional needs, and we are the vital source of support to get those children on the right educational journey and to support their needs, ensuring that their needs are met on an individual basis. All children that are in that programme receive speech and language support from our own speech and language therapist. 83 of those children have completed Hannon assessments, and it's a tool that's used to support the children's language. And 89% of those children using bilingual profile, and that is an assessment tool that is used for with children that language isn't English, so they have a second language or their first language, and they have shown areas where they have progressed in more than one area. Our Family Support Outcome Star tool shows the families are supported effectively and children's development. 93% of the parents are supported to enhance their parenting skills using one or more stars. The Department of Education's First Star policy recognises and highlights the impact of early years on the future outcomes and the important investment in this area. The Ray Jones and the Independent Review on the Education both recognise that Chairperson is a powerful tool for vehicle of delivery. The review of Chairperson noted that Chairperson is the only universal early years intervention in Northern Ireland that focuses both on the needs of children, parents and families living in disadvantaged areas. The evidence of the impact of Chairperson is that it reduces children's hospital admissions, positive outcomes for parents and children. Therefore, Chairperson is the only universal early intervention service in Northern Ireland making the impact and focusing both on the needs of children and parents. I'm going to pass you over to Mervyn now. We'll give you more information on sustaining funding within Chairperson, but I'm happy to answer any more questions that you may have.
Thanks, Siobhan. Good afternoon, everybody. Joy and Siobhan have given you some of the background, the context, the purpose and an indication of lived impact for many of our families, ensuring that critical and crucial early intervention is available for children antenatally and postnatally, and for parents and families at the precise time that support, assistance or guidance is required. And we've mapped out a some 25-year journey for Sure Start as an embedded and sustained place-based service with demonstrable outcomes and wide policy recognition. But yet we face ongoing year-on-year financial pressures, and I want to focus just briefly on those now. So again, by way of context, from 2013 we've seen a 65% increase in the national minimum wage. From 2013 we've experienced a near 40% increase in electricity costs. Salary levels within early years and childcare sector remain low. Often our staff say that they could get more for stacking shelves in local supermarkets than they do, unfortunately, from us. And for 25-26 budget, so the budget year coming forward, we've reported inescapable pressures of £209,683 just across the 9 Belfast Sure Starts. And that's really aligned to the national insurance contribution increases, and obviously there's the remaining 20 odd Sure Starts who would have the same pressures. But from 2013 to 2024 we only saw an average of a 1% per annum increase in Sure Start budgets. In 24-25 we were delighted to receive a 10% uplift in budget, enabling a further 22 super output areas to be mainstreamed to core Sure Start delivery. And the annual Sure Start budget now sits at 33.67 million. But we continue to face rising costs of utilities, venue, premises, rents, programmes. Trust-led Sure Starts have absorbed 2 5% HSE pay awards in the financial year 24-25. And our community-led Sure Starts have offered staff the first meaningful pay increase for nearly 3 years. So we have a bit of a dichotomy. On one hand, we're an established, recognised early intervention service, community-based in areas of greatest need, securing outcomes for children, families and parents against a year-on-year battle to balance the books and deal with the pressures outlined above. And that was one of our key drivers to talk to you about sustainable funding models, which would provide projects with consistency and security and allow for proper longer-term planning and delivery. And those possible options might be a 3-year budget aligned to our 3-year plan that we submit to the department, or provision of an inflation-related budget guaranteeing year-on-year cost of living increases, or even a move within the Department of Education to ring fence and properly protect Sure Start funding, or even all 3 of those. We're not greedy at all. What we are keen to avoid is the feast and famine approach over the last 10 years. So 5 years of standstill budgets, 1 year of a cut, 4 years of small increases, and thankfully a couple of years of more substantial increase. So we as a Sure Start programme across Northern Ireland continue to adapt, grow, develop and innovate services despite the financial uncertainty. We have sustained place-based interventions, partnerships and collaborations, and what we desperately need is a sustained funding model, and would say let's protect and certainly your most crucial early intervention and support asset. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I'll maybe just begin by noting, I think, behalf of all the committee, we are really conscious of the really great work that Sure Start deliver, and I think across all our individual constituencies that we represent here, we are aware of the really, really vital work that you do in the early year space. So I think it's important to note that. Picking up really from where Mervyn left off on resource, so you've set out some things that would be helpful in terms of a more sustainable model. Looking to the year ahead, first of all, you're clear that the budgetary pressures are quite significant. The national insurance rise in and of itself, regardless of any other pressures that would be around, is putting the whole community and voluntary sector under serious pressure. For the year ahead, do you have an idea? Currently, 33 million, was that last year's funding? Is that
was last year's funding?
So that was 24-25. To be able to navigate the financial year we are now in, what would you say would be the sort of budgetary line that you would need just to keep heads above water?
I need to be careful because last year when we met with the Minister, we had a similar question beforehand and we answered it ourselves and said, we'll ask for 10% and we got 10%. So what's in your piece of paper, Chair?
Ask for 20.
Ask for 20. My colleagues are greedy. I think we're really looking at, I guess the 2 pressures this year are certainly the increase in terms of the national insurance contribution. That has been significant. The figures that are quoted, the 200,000, is just for the 9 Belfast projects. So I guess if you multiply that by 4 in terms of across the province, you're looking at close to 1 million probably, just in terms of pressures that we will need to find from a budget that, in the grand scheme of things, isn't that large. And we're still finding the additional pressures that are there in terms of, obviously, projects are located in areas of most need, and we tend to use community venues. And we have our own administrative bases. So mundane things like rent increases, utility increases, all have an impact on us and have to come out of the budget. So we're really looking at, I guess, inflationary plus in terms of whatever percentage figure that would turn out to be. I'm trying in my head to work out 209,000 across I don't even know what the 9 projects in Belfast, what the combined budget is, to give you a percentage.
Maybe it's unfair to put you in the spot. In terms of engagement with the department around the 25-26 budget, is that a live process? Has there been engagement?
There hasn't been this year. We've been asked to submit spending plans on the basis of a standstill, but there have been discussions in terms of the inescapable pressures were collected in December. And I think submitted through the department through SPPG, so they're aware of those. and there was a conversation around expanding reach a little bit in terms of 5% of families who live outside of the ward areas. So there was a piece of work completed on that as well. So those are the things that the department have asked for. They haven't exactly asked for anything in budgets at the minute.
That's fine. And look, I'll maybe just finish on the budget question with just if we did end up at a standstill position, what does that look like for services?
It looks like it is just pressure, and because of the way we operate, it's either going to be we reduce staffing levels or we don't fill vacancies, which is akin to losing staff, or we reduce programs. And we can't deliver exactly what we want to deliver within areas. So those are the stark realities. For community-led colleagues, it means that staff don't get a pay award potentially again, or any increase in their salaries. We're a trust-led Sure Start, so we have no control over that. There'll be something come through from HSE, and we'll have to absorb that cost as well. So it manifests itself in different ways, and we have to be very adept and nimble at responding and finding out where we can absorb those costs. But ultimately, it affects the workforce, and it affects what we're doing on a front line with families. Sorry, Joe.
It's a lack of planning, it's a stop-start that's very difficult. And we are sitting here now, we're into April, and an organisation like ours is a company limited by guarantee. Yeah. We shouldn't be actually operating without some confirmation of budget. It's the same in the community sector, I know. So, how do you plan and how do you move forward? And it would just be some sort of continuity. If this is a programme that we're investing in, sustaining, we know there's inflation every year. Whatever, the government gets through the Barn formula, but something that you sort of can look to the future and say, well, we're not going to have to not fill posts and then run at the end of the year or halfway end of the year, then have money that we don't know how to spend. It's just manic every year really, and it's very distracting from what we're actually trying to do.
Can I answer just from a community project? Mm-hmm. I'm Tracy, by the way, and I'm the spare today. But over the last probably 4 or 5 years, we have taken a hit in terms of just not replacing staff. So we're running consistently 3 staff behind what we were, which impacts on our services. And this year, certainly, if we don't get an uplift, we will have to lose staff. And I have to say, our staff are highly trained, excellent at what they do, and very difficult to replace at times. So, that's the effect.
That's I think that's set out the position pretty clearly, and I think the comments in the presentation around a more sustainable, secure model going forward. Obviously, there's the immediate issue of this financial year, but we really do need to look at what would be more sustainable for you as an organisation going forward. I'm probably gonna leave my comments there, other than really probably just to make a comment. I think we talk a lot about early years in childcare, and the childcare and the cost of childcare absolutely rightly gets a huge amount of focus. But I think we can sometimes forget about early years, and the strategy when it eventually arrives, if it ever arrives, is an early education and childcare strategy. And I think the role of organisations like yours is so important. And if we're serious about early intervention, we need to invest in it. So I think that's been set out very clearly. That's all for me. So I'm going to open up to members at this stage. So okay, Kathy.
Thanks.
Peter.
Sure. You've sort of explained everything really, really well there, and especially the pressures that you're coming under with the workforce, and I know that's across the board. And you mentioned there about community and voluntary. So one thing I wanted to pick up on, Marvin, you mentioned it there about how we move forward with the childcare and early years strategy that we're looking at, and how does Sure Start fit within that in terms of growth? Do you see the future being expanding Sure Start, as in the centres that are there at the minute, and expanding those, or do we need to see more Sure Starts in other areas? I think you mentioned, Joy, it was a 42% of the SOAs are covered at the minute. And Joy, you mentioned it as well around Downpatrick, and I would work quite closely with the Downpatrick Sure Start, and they're absolutely fantastic, the work that they do. But I know that in my constituency office, I will get parents contacting me because they fall just outside that kind of postcode lottery that they face. So how do you see it moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one. I think, every year I have more people applying for our programme for 2-year-olds than we can take, and most of us are in the same position. So yes, should we expand Sure Start in that sense? I think there's always more room for growth within where we are. But do I, and I think I speak for us all, do I think that Sure Start should be available for everybody? No, absolutely not. I don't think that is a fair process. I think Sure Start was always brought in to be an early intervention for those who need it most, and if we give it to everybody, then those who need it most will not benefit from it. But I do think what we need is a brilliant early years and childcare strategy that has, Sure Start at the very core of it, supporting, those people who absolutely need it the most to the best that we can possibly do. And then we need to have good provision outside of that in those outer areas where there is still, early years provision. And at the moment that there are gaps in those areas, big gaps. And I'm not saying that people in those gaps don't need it. I think there's been a conversation about the, out of area, 5% out of area fund, which would be really welcome and an excellent way to solve some of those issues. But if you were going to ask, if the question is, should we have Sure Start for everybody? I think from all of our years' experience, we feel that would be a big mistake.
And if I could add, if we talked about what happened in England, and we're practically very little now, and it was like they just continued to expand, and it almost to try to get to that, and we can see what happened, and we're already spread in some extent when we talk about budgets. I mean, there's only something like 20% roughly, say, of children that actually live in a Sure Start area that there would be a place in a programme for 2-year-olds. Yeah. So you might need to think, if we're working in the most sort of deprived areas, about that. I'm very sorry, by the way, about my phone. I thought I had to turn it off. Apologies.
You're not the first, Joy.
We've all been there.
Actually, I've had Hugo Duncan on the other week.
Oh, very much levelling. We're talking about inequalities and reducing inequalities. Yeah. And how can you reduce inequalities if everybody gets the same all the time?
Yeah. So probably more targeted intervention into the areas that we're in at the minute.
I think levelling up is the catchword at the minute, but I suppose when Sure Start was initiated, it was on that premise. Let's put it in the areas where it's most required, and let's put it there on a longitudinal basis, so that some of the patterns that have been created are the patterns that you can turn a curve on, and parents begin to parent in different ways, and children begin to grow up in different ways. And if you're doing that from the community base, I think we've got a better chance of dealing with some of those inequalities that exist between areas within the province. Yeah.
Absolutely, thanks for that. And like again, you've mentioned there about that whole, it's more than, it's the wraparound support that comes with it as well.
Holistic service that's offered, it's the support offered from antenatal right through till the child's gone into preschool, and I suppose it's really building on what we are actually offering without expanding and diluting the service down.
Just want to pick up quickly on one of the points as well you mentioned around the workforce issues, and again I know that's across the board. Can you maybe elaborate a bit more even on I know that there's severe budgetary constraints, and I understand that. Is there more to it than that in terms of skills development and career progression, and maybe even the professionalisation of the workforce as well? Because I know the workforce is the key here. These are on the ground with the children. So is there something around that needs to be included within the strategy as well?
I think there's maybe something in terms of how childcare and early intervention work, family support is perceived, and I think as collectively as a society we could do more on that, and actually see it as something that is of great value and should be invested in and recognised, rather than just that you're looking after my children and that anybody can do it, because I think what we'd all say is the amount of work as coordinators that we've put in terms of a workforce development has been significant. The range of training, coaching and mentoring, progression that's been available. We've taken staff from probably the lowest level out of school with few qualifications through to very senior roles within the organisation. I'm very proud of growing our own and bringing those folks through. So there's probably something in terms of societally wide, in terms of how the area of work is perceived, but a recognition from I guess what we're doing ourselves and really investing in our workers and ensuring that they are skilled and experienced, knowledgeable, and continue to be. So as new initiatives and new opportunities come on board, it's about making those available to staff and having that in place.
Just bringing our time to a close on this, because we do have a packed agenda, so I'll draw that to a close there and bring the next member in, which is Peter.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. And can I echo what the Chair said at the start? I have long pushed for early intervention, and Sure Start's an excellent example of that. I think and you reflect that in your evidence. I'll come to that in a second. My first question just around your SLT from the presentation that you submitted to us, and there's a figure here, 48% had attended Sure Start speech and language services. Was that figure of 48%, is that 48% of all the children that Sure Start see? I mean, is that...
Yes, that would be, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And can I then ask just for a little bit more detail around what that speech and language service is? It's an area that I'm very interested in. I think it's a really powerful intervention. I was wondering what, and I should know the answer. On committees, you might not know the answer before you ask, know the answer, but I don't know the answer to this one, so I'm genuinely very interested. What does that speech and language service actually look like?
It's between this one. It's a different model in some ways. It's about, we have a regional Sure Start speech and language model, and it's really a capacity building model, because the front facing people that are with the children, etc. They are the ones that are with them and promoting and focusing on that child speech and language development, supporting that child speech and language development. And the speech and language therapists that are in Sure Start are mainly to support the staff to build their skills, to be there for them, for the training, for that. Now, individually they will, come out, visit, see an individual child, etc. But it's that whole organisational approach and the messages that and everybody does speech and language within Sure Start. The speech and language therapists are very key to helping everybody do that well. Folks. I would actually say 100% of the children that actually use Sure Start are receiving a speech and language service.
Yeah.
It's just parents don't.
But they maybe get a bit more of a specific one in those figures. And I think it's really interesting to note that speech and language, often people think about speech and language just in that way, around speech and language, but speech and language is about communication, and communication starts at birth. And a lot of our speech and language therapists would have gone through that journey with our staff and ourselves around it's before, it's in the womb, it's as soon as the baby is born, it's that attuned, attentive parenting that we're all modelling in all of our Sure Starts. And that is the thing that builds the great foundation for the speech. So it's not just about teaching somebody to talk, it's really about attuned and attentive parenting, and about recognising if somebody has an issue in that area, that may be an additional needs or issue, but it also may be just the fact that somewhere along the road the attuned and attentive parenting hasn't been great, and we can work on that with the parents. So it's a big wide topic, I think.
Just one final comment. The slide is from the parental survey. So it's 48% of parents who were asked the question had availed of services. So it's interesting if you then read that in conjunction with the other services that are available. So parents would have, might have been a stay and play, might have been the programme for twos, might have been health visitor, might have been midwifery services. So that's specifically where the 48% comes, which I guess is again a strength of the model in terms of if you have a breadth of service, then you go and pick and choose what you need in terms of your own family needs or child needs.
I think that's an incredibly interesting answer. I was just to hear Joy say actually kind of 100% of us do speech and language, and it's that model of, and I assume there are SLT provision, possibly from the trusts or that come in, but it's just the way you answered that actually everyone does it, and there's that really, top-down sort of flowing training nearly and support within the organisation. I'm gonna note that one away. That's really, really interesting.
Not a huge amount of time left, so
I'll try and get my second question out here then, Chair. So I'm going to take you to your written evidence, which you submitted in, and it's around the wave trust. And I've note that you have a quote here from somebody I've done work with, George Hoskins. I've done quite a bit of work with George in the past around ACEs and the first 1,000 days. There's 6 things that you list there, and I'm not going to read them all out because the Chair's not going to let me have time, but it's around prioritising investment, parenting, dividends from early intervention, etc., etc. My question is, do you think politicians have got this? Okay, so what you're citing in your oral evidence here, which is really what you've called the 6 key messages, okay, about early intervention. Do you think politicians have got this?
Yeah, a quick answer, but do address it, please.
I know I didn't before I had come into Sure Start, and I didn't for many years when I was still in Sure Start, because we don't often talk about small babies and how they develop and how their brains develop and so on. And when you start to actually think about it, I mean, the first time a person said to me, "You learn how to be a parent when you're a baby," and I go, "What a ridiculous concept!" It took me a long way, but I think not all politicians do understand the crucial aspect of very young children in our society, just how important they are. And you sometimes see it, like out of all the things I've done, the health service, the children's hospitals, the one that come last, it's full of very small babies. They don't have a voice. So I don't think all politicians do get it. I think there was a point, you're talking about George Hoskins, when there was a lot of stuff and work done and politicians came along and heard a lot of this stuff, but we haven't had that for a long time. So I think we do need to go back and start talking about the first 1,001 days again.
I'll have to draw a line on it, but I think the answer was clear, that we need to be much more mindful of the serious impact of early intervention at the very youngest age. So I think that's the crucial point. Okay, Colin, you had indicated next.
Thanks, Chair, and can I thank you all for your time today? It's been really informative and beneficial. Just on the first question, on the partnership work and the lead or accountable bodies, the employers, the Department of Health, Education, can I ask what challenges you face ensuring that your services and programmes actually reach those most vulnerable within our communities?
Well, I mean, talking personally, in East Belfast, we have a very, we don't actually have lots of issues around that. Our community partners are really keen to learn from Sure Start, and I do think that that's how Sure Start should be. I think Sure Start should have, Joy talked about expertise. We have 25 years of expertise. We should be giving that away, and helping to build capacity in our communities and our community partners. I mean, partnership working is always, tricky at times, but on the whole, I have seen a growing fascination with the early years in the recent years, and a wanting to get involved and learn about that. But that I can only speak from my own.
I think you also were looking at families who are considered hard to reach, aren't you? You do have to think and use every method in the book, I think, sometimes to engage some of the families that need to use you most, and or who would benefit the most. And it is a good thing because there's little stigma in Sure Start. So it's kind of like we say to people, it's your right to have it.
Yeah.
And that helps. So you're not going, oh, you're a really needy family or something like that. It's not. So, but you have to think, and that's why the 25 years is a good thing. And Sure Start has a reasonably solid reputation. I think it's a very good reputation actually out in most communities. Mm-hmm. So we don't have the barriers that maybe you know, a statutory sector service. Our schools sometimes have, or whatever, and we do a lot of community things. So we feel like we're really embedded in the community and part of the community. Many of the staff actually come from the community. So all of those things help. All of those things.
Well, thanks. And I think that's a real testament to Sure Start, that the way you do operate and network with your other partners, and you don't necessarily face those challenges. I think that is a real testament and something you just need to be proud of. The last question is, we mentioned about the 38 individual Sure Starts, and each of those 38 undoubtedly are in very different communities, and although the programmes and the services are totally the same, how do you ensure that the first needs within those individual communities are being dealt with? Like, I'm thinking the newcomers or newcomer families, those who maybe need the help but wouldn't be forthcoming. Like, how do you ensure that within those individual 38 communities, although the programmes are the same, how do you ensure that those families' needs are being met?
I guess SPPG would probably say from their perspective that's part of their role in terms of the commissioner and the oversight. So obviously we're submitting annual plans, we're putting in quarterly returns, we have targets that we commit to, we're providing some narrative reporting as well in terms of some of the more qualitative aspects. So I guess there's a crucial role for them in terms of ensuring that happens. All of the projects have their own localised management committees, and they're the real operational driver. And invariably, those committees are made up of community organisations, local organisations. So again, there's a wealth of knowledge and expertise there, which I guess drives. I'm based in Lower North Belfast. The increase in newcomer families over the last 5 years has been through the roof. It's been phenomenal. They actually seek us out. We don't have to do a great deal of work. It's fabulous. So they know where we are and they know what we can avail of. So there's also that. If you're an established community service, then you are recognised for what you provide, and people will navigate and gravitate to you as well. So I think it's probably a combination of all of those, which allows each of the projects to be very adept at what it does within the community, certainly in terms of committees and what they bring, and the expertise and the challenge in terms of making sure that plans are reflective of the needs that are out there.
And I think it's about knowing the community.
Time up, so just a very brief answer to close
It's
that
just
one off.
about knowing the community that you live in and being responsive to the needs of your service users and the community around you. And I think if you've got that, then you can build in your project.
That's great. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Michelle, you'd indicated next.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks so much for your evidence. I think everybody has said how great an organisation Sure Start is, so I'm just going to echo that, but don't want to flatter you too much, you know. So, like, a lot of the ground's been covered already, so I'm going to start with a really broad question. Just so you're on the coalface and you're dealing with parents all the time, what are you hearing now from parents in terms of what their needs are and how you need to respond to that?
One of the big issues, I just suppose really one of the big issues out there at the moment is mental health. Okay, I think that's something that hasn't improved and has got worse, maybe even since COVID times. And there's a lot of poor mental health, and people being really challenged by that. So I'm just going to put that out as that I think in the areas we work, mental health is an issue.
Yeah.
Maybe other people feel the
Yeah, the cost of living, and they're all linked to each other. But the cost of living is, something that our parents struggle with, day in, day out, and that causes poor mental health, and then that affects their ability to, parent, in a very attuned way because their head's full of other things. So, yeah, and I think not to go on, but in our communities, the issue with drugs is escalating, and it's becoming, very serious now. In our families, yeah.
And in our family support team, we're seeing a lot with housing issues, which I'm sure across the project everybody is seeing. And we're support for children with SEN. We're supporting them up until they leave our services, but then it's the wraparound support that they receive after. It's definitely impacting my project.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of my follow-up was around SEN and just what role you guys play in identifying those needs and getting support for kids.
We probably start from, our approach would be start antenatally.
Yeah.
So Peter was talking about SLTs and speech and language, so a lot of our work would be the importance of engaging with the baby in the womb. It's very neuroscience-y now, but the importance of that bonding and attachment, which as soon as the baby arrives, then as Tracy said, the attuned and attentive caregiver can kick in. That's absolutely vital. So the more solid the foundation from the beginning, then you're beginning to, I guess, reduce some of those pressures that might come further down the line. But Siobhan's right. We are seeing an increase in challenging behaviour. We're seeing an increase in lack of speech language communication, lack of ability for children to self-regulate, control their emotions, the inability to socialise with peers. We're seeing a lot of COVID babies now coming in as 2 and 3 year olds and seeing the impact of that. So all of those are coming together as a mix in terms of additional needs, and I guess preventing children going forward into the start of their educational journey on a sounder footing. So we would start as early as possible.
I suppose on a practical note, we will support the families to get to the right placement, so that we will start their transition, whether it's a referral to speech and language, whether it's a referral to linking in with their health visitor, whether it's a referral to ASD or whether it's a CDC, and we will support them in the Sure Start project wherever we can. If they're in our developmental programme for 2-year-olds and it's not the right setting, we have additional needs programmes there. And we will get them on the right journey to suit their needs. I myself have educational psychology placement students in my setting who come to get the expertise about Sure Start, because we need to learn our educational psychologists that are going to be working in a few years' time about the needs of children. So we will try to support where we can.
And the confidence for parents, supporting parents too, because kind of a lot of parents are going to have to spend their whole life advocating for their kid. And it's trying to support them to have that self-confidence, to keep asking the questions as they go through school, to keep making the demands, to keep, the journey ahead of them through the formal education system, and us saying, no, you have a valued voice in your child, and you stay there.
Just one other thing, the independent review of education, it had a recommendation around Sure Starts that they should be resourced up to 20 hours per week to provide kind of free childcare for parents in experiencing poverty, so that the parent could go out to work. Is that something that you have been working with the department on? Is that something you're looking to take forward?
Just coming to the close of the time on this, so just a brief answer on that one.
I mean, I don't know. The answer is we haven't been working with the department on that question. And I think if that question came to us, that would be a conversation. But it would certainly, it's not necessarily the way we operate at the moment. And we don't really see ourselves as childcare, more as child development and early intervention. But as I said, I think that's fair. We haven't been approached. So,
Deputy Chair, you were wanting to come in. I'm not sure if
Yes.
your timing allows you, does it?
As quickly as
You
possible.
will,
Can you tell me how many children are learning through the medium of Irish in Sure Start?
I wouldn't have a figure.
Even a rough
We wouldn't
idea?
have a figure, but I suppose in terms of my project, we work alongside all of our local nursery schools to support the child on the journey. This year alone, we've had 3 children who were in our 2-year-old programme and then progressed on to into the NINRA that would be in the Irish provision, and we did provide Irish language sing, sign and rhyme session for our families to to go to, and then we would work alongside Gornamona and the nursery schools in the community, but I wouldn't have a figure in hand. It is something I could give back to Liz if you need.
we do have resources, speech and language resources in the Irish medium as well.
Fair enough. And are you expecting any sort of commitment in the early year and childcare strategy to keep up with the growing demand within Irish medium? Because there is a fear that if Irish medium isn't available within Sure Start, that some parents may be deterred from taking their place. Have you any view on that?
Yeah. I mean, because in the Irish medium, children sometimes can get 2 years of preschool, although all children seem to be able to get to now. Sometimes there are children who come into one of our programmes and leave to go in during the course of the year then to an Irish medium. So I do think there's a wee bit that needs to be worked out about it, because you know, it is really good for the 2 to 3 year olds to be in the small settings that Sure Start can provide, and then move forward, and we need to work together with all of the schools. We have some Irish medium programmes for 2 in Sure Start, specifically Sure Start programmes in Irish medium facilities. I know that in the West, and I don't think there has been any, as far as I know, anything coming up that we've been told about anything in the childcare strategy. Saying that, what do you call the Irish Medium organisation, you know, that has some Sure Start 2 to 3s? I'm sure they've been advocating for it. No.
Beachmount Sure Start has an Irish 2-year-old programme.
In Westfield, that's when 12 places allocated each year, and what we've noticed is year on year parents requesting Irish medium, as opposed to when we originally set up our 2 projects, we would have allocated families to each project. We now have parents saying, I want my child to go to the Irish medium setting, so we obviously try to meet that need, and those parents then go on to send their children to Gale School and further. But there are a couple of other projects in West Belfast that also provide the Irish medium, but we also have a combination kind of specifically in our project where we have a lot of asylum seeking families who English isn't their first language either, so it's trying to balance everybody's needs.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Just helpfully for the record, for the other representative from Sure Start there, if we could we get the details of just who that was for our committee record, just to know who made a really helpful contribution, but just to know.
Ambrose from
thank you.
Beachmount Sure Start.
No, that's absolutely fine. Dana, you'd indicated.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I'm very lucky to have my office next door to a Sure Start, so I get to hear all the lovely singing and all the great work that goes on a daily basis. I suppose, but where I represent as well, it has a very young population. I think Collins sits around 30,000 people in it, and 18,000 that is under the age of 18, so many people have benefited from Sure Start. But what I have noticed in the past number of years is that growing need for special educational needs, and I suppose just from your end, what advocating is going on to get more places for families, and then also maybe some of the outworkings of your parenting programs that support parents who have additional needs, because that's also a big issue that I find, literacy skills and also additional needs within the parents. But it is a growing concern, and a lot of the parents that do come to me as well to say they're almost lost, like the support. So what more we can do, and just take a bit of advice from yourselves.
I guess we're probably as frustrated as parents in terms of statutory services that are there in terms of waiting lists, and the pressures that all parents are facing, and that's outside of our control. And I guess we can lobby as much as everybody else in terms of that being addressed. I suppose where we try and be as adept is in terms of signposting, and that obviously earlier identification. Now, we wouldn't run diagnostic services, but we can certainly refer through to core services, to the child development clinic, to the specialist services, and assist parents with doing that. The work that Siobhan does with the educational psychologists is another aspect of that breadth of service that's there. So trying to get in as early as possible and supporting as early as possible. I think the other thing we would do is try and build parental capacity and skills and strategies themselves. St. Peter asked about SLTs. That's a core role of the speech and language therapists within our projects. They don't hold cases, but they build capacity with parents. They build capacity with staff to build capacity with parents. So those are probably some of the areas that we would be working hardest in.
Can I just come in there? So myself and Caroline, my colleague from Glenbrook Sure Start, have been working this year in the last 3 years on a pilot with 2 other community organisations, Solus and Kids Together, on a Little Learners programme, which is specific for children with communication difficulties and ASD. Highly successful programme. The outcomes of that programme are quite phenomenal. We've done that in partnership with health as well. So we have speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, and educational psychologists working alongside in Sure Starts and in those other organisations. So I would just make the point that we are literally fighting at the moment to maintain funding for that. And if that doesn't come through, then we will have to either lose them or cut our delivery in two. And that's really disappointing because, again, my colleague Caroline, she actually devised this whole programme, and it has got a good track record. It really brings results. It's a growing need. It's a brilliant model that could be rolled out, and I think there's some frustration at the fact that that's just not being picked up now. But we are definitely on it, and we want to be on it, and we feel that yes, it is our job to be meeting the needs in a growing population of children who have really complex needs.
And I suppose that goes full circle to what was said earlier on, saying, do politicians get it? Well, if that's cut, then they don't get it.
I feel like if politicians got this, that we wouldn't be sitting here pleading with you. I think that's the answer that I would give. And that's not everybody, because some people do get it amazingly, but does our government get early intervention? I don't think so.
I think it's a nice buzzword that's used a lot, and I suppose then the next question would be, then what engagement has the Department of Education had with us around the childcare strategy? Because it's clear early intervention's key to this, and if they're not having these conversations with you, then again it just could be just words again on a piece of paper that I get plastered this whole room with the amount of papers that have been done over the last 2 decades around special educational needs, and I just don't want to see that failure again.
I don't know. I mean, one of the frustrations is, we don't have the time. Sometimes children are identified as needing that additional support. Sometimes takes parents a wee while to accept that. There's a whole journey there. Sometimes you just don't have the time because there's waiting lists and all the rest of it for anybody to say, this is what the issue is here. So we have children who have been in our groups and have made progress, are really beginning to do well, have settled. It takes skill to get that to happen and all for some of those children. And then they're ending up in an ordinary nursery school in the local area with 26 children in a classroom. And we know when these wee totes are heading off to go to we know they're not going to do, it's not going to work. And the parents are coming back and saying, you can't be in more than half an hour a day and a morning, and this is happening all the time, every year.
And that feeds into
it's heartbreaking.
My frustration. That's reduced timetables, and I suppose the point is, if they're not listening to use it early intervention and communicating and brings it part of the process, then it's going to be another failed strategy. So that was my point.
Yeah. And could I just say, there's 26 children in a nursery with 2 kids. And this year they will take younger children in because the demographics are down this year, the population. So you will have children over a 2-year age range in the one room, some of them which will have, say for example, autism and are not coping. And instead of the department saying, okay, we will fund your nursery classroom, you don't have to pack it with 26 children, knowing that there is a lot of needs there. There's just, why do we need 26 small children together bunched in the room?
We can certainly pick that up with the officials coming in, because it's something with the admissions process hasn't necessarily gone very smoothly for preschool this year, shall we say, and issues have emerged around that, and just the issue of non-target age children in statutory preschool settings, and the appropriateness of that, and the appropriateness of that being funded in statutory settings. There are a range of questions there, so I think that's well worth drawing out. I don't have any other indications apart from Cara online, so I'll bring Cara in and then David. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Just a sincere thank you to our panel for being here, and your opening briefing answered a lot of my questions, and thank you for giving us a lot of detail around the special educational needs aspect of stuff. And us as a committee, we've been talking about the challenges with mental health in young people, so I really appreciate that you've touched on that as well, and that you are seeing that in early years, and that's important for us to know. I just have one question. I've been down myself to your core Sure Start, and during times of budgeting constraints and concerns, I had a chat with your staff, and just the level of enthusiasm and passion that they have for their job It's incredible. So to think that they had that period of uncertainty, would they be staying in the job? Would they not due to budget constraints was awful. Just one question, which is, do you think the department has a strong enough understanding of the value of the work that you do? I'm mindful because you do so much when it comes to being a preventative role, whether it's, child protection, educating young parents on how to take care of their children, and even you could go as far to say ensuring that young children don't come into contact with the justice system later in life. All the evidence is there. Do you think that the department realises the importance of investment in Sure Start, particularly as a prevention mechanism and early intervention?
I think yes. No, I think they do.
Yeah,
To be fair,
I do too.
and it hasn't always been like that, but it's a growing thing, and that we have some civil services in our department who are really catching on big time about what it's worth, and they're very, very supportive, and we're working as much as we can together. So on the whole, I would say, and that's where you have a bit of continuity of civil servants as well, when you keep moving them about. they can't learn, but yep, I think it's improved hugely.
It's improved, yeah.
I think as well, I spent 25 years of my working career in England, and was in England at the time when Sure Starts and children's centres were decimated as a result of austerity measures from 2010 onwards. And that's not happening here, and let's hope that continues to be the case, because the impact that it had in many areas in England was disastrous. Notwithstanding the pressures that we face year on year, there still is a core Sure Start budget. It's still sustained. We've been going for 25 years, and that's probably testament to both departments, health and education. So hopefully that would be the same. It's not just us saying that. Range upon range of report that comes out invariably mentions Sure Start when it talks about early intervention or child development work or support to families. So the department get it, and people outside of the department, academics and researchers get it as well. So hopefully those two coalescing could be advantageous to us.
There's a positive. That's brilliant. 'Cause when I had visited Sure Start in Korean, I didn't realise the variety. Everything from breastfeeding education. They recognise the first signs sometimes of postpartum depression, and of course, even in those early stages of getting diagnosed with autism, they can sort of see if something, is where they go in to seek out a diagnosis. So just to say, we really value the work that you're doing, and this was a really informative briefing today, and we're very grateful as a committee for you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cara, and that just leaves David then.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for your presentation so far, and echo the words of my colleagues around praise for Sure Start. And I recognise what Tracy talks about in terms of the strong partnership work and network. Sure Start is a key part of it, but I think in East Belfast in particular, we have a really strong community network that really wants to serve those most in need within our communities, and Sure Start is certainly a key part of that. Probably following on slightly from what Cara said, I want to know, you're an organisation that works across areas that are relevant to a number of our government departments. A key issue that this committee routinely returns to is this idea of, it's been around a long time, the breaking down of silos and working across departments. Do you think that our departments are getting better at that it happens well, or is that something that, what is your experience in terms of the interface of yourselves with our government departments, and the fact that you work across areas that there really should be collaboration between departments in?
Go you.
I think that, again, it is getting better. I have seen a big improvement in it in the last, I've been in Sure for 10 years, and I do think it's getting better, but I think there is more work that could be done, and that is my diplomatic answer. But I think it's important for Sure Start to be in those rooms. There is a lot of, we come back to that word expertise. There's a lot of expertise from people who've been in this a long time, and sometimes I feel like people don't ask. They don't ask us, what do you think?
Okay.
And that is really hard sometimes, because people make decisions about the way that we operate or what comes into our areas or what other funding lands near us, and there's no real consultation.
And across all departments?
At times, yeah. And it's not like we want to be involved in everything, but I think sometimes just being asked the question, well, what do you think about that, and how would that land with Sure Start, and how does that buff against Sure Start, and how can it, support, would be a really healthy question if it came more often. That's just how I feel.
Thank you very much. The one other question, and it's probably veers into, is probably something that's more relevant to the Health Committee in terms of public health and so on, but as you've said, the crossover in this and some of those issues that we face in education start much earlier. And that was just what surprised me, and I don't say this to stigmatise or judge anyone, but it just was a shock to me around the percentage of mothers who smoked during pregnancy that was in your stats. It's mothers living in Sure Start areas sit at 19% in 2021, down to possibly at least down to 17.7 in 21-22. Do we know if that has continued to fall? And what worries me is just a quick look there, sort of prevalence of smoking, current smokers in Northern Ireland amongst women is at 12%. 12% across the board, and in mothers in Sure Starters we're talking about almost a fifth at one stage. Is that a really serious issue? What work do you do around that? What's needed around that? Do we have similar work going on around alcohol as well?
Yes, we would have I think it's hard to get up-to-date stats because the site that we use from the Children and Young People Strategic Partnership has changed in terms of ward boundaries, so it's harder now to do a like-for-like comparison. But you're right, the downward trend was there. We would do an awful lot of work around diet, nutrition, healthy eating, smoking cessation, work in the round just in terms of healthy lifestyles. We're just about to roll out the Henry programme, which is looking at diet, exercise, nutrition, behaviour, family life, coping with stress. So I suppose I guess we probably try and see things in the round and as part of an holistic programme rather than specifically targeting in on individual pressures. But they're there and we're aware of them and support as much as we can.
Could I ask what is the impact of that?
Time is nearly up, so just a really quick answer to that.
I think it's really important to note that in areas of deprivation where people have experienced complex issues, that any form of substance use with alcohol, drugs, or is just communication of that nervous system. And I think that's a really important thing to see it as. Yes. Because you actually have to get under the let's just slap a patch on somebody's arm and get them stop smoking. You actually have to get under and go, what is happening in that person's life to make them be addicted to a substance? And for us, that's early intervention. I feel those conversations, that kind of education with our parents is happening all the time around their needs and their emotional needs, and being emotionally intelligent around those needs and the needs of their children. So whilst I think smoking cessation classes happen and all of that other thing, I think the deeper work, the most important work, is the fact that we're able to engage parents on, what does a baby need when they're born, and how do they grow up to be a healthy adult who is not, everybody, but lots of people take a drink and smoke, but an addiction is just communication of a nervous system that's not working. And I think that's really important for us to realise that as a society.
Yeah, and I know my time's up, sure, but just to say that my approach to that was it was a shock to me and was interesting in the topic. It's not to I've never walked in those people's shoes or the complex needs that they have, but I think quite a few people would be maybe shocked at that statistic. So that was thank you.
I have to draw a line there. Unfortunately, there's so much. Unfortunately, I can't bring anybody else in. That's been a really helpful briefing. There's so much that we could cover. I've tried to rigidly stick to everyone's timings today, and we're still substantially over time. So it's there'll be time for a whole other evidence session, I'm sure, on a lot of the things and the work that you do. So thank you for your presentation. There's an awful lot there that we can potentially pick up with the department. They're coming in to speak on a very wide remit, so we may not be able to take all your issues up. I'm sure members will try, but we will also wrap up at the end of the session in terms of any specific further follow-ups with the department. So I think it's been clear in terms of the committee's support for your work, and we will continue to do that and hopefully engage with you in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we stay and hear this?
You can stay in the public gallery. You're very welcome to. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank
You're
you.
very welcome. While the witnesses were just doing a swap around before our next item, I'm going to suggest to members that we maybe wrap up actions at the end of the department's briefing, because I think we may pick up some of the things that we would be perhaps raising with the department in the next briefing if members are agreed with that, and then we can move straight on to the next witnesses. So if we can bring the next witnesses through, and I will just move on to that, so I'll just take members to item 7 on the agenda, and that is the Early Learning Childcare Strategy proposals for 2025-26 from the Department of Education, and there is a briefing note from the committee clerk at page 104 and a briefing paper from the Department of Education at page 105, and I think really the briefing will be to look specifically at that strategy development, but you'll see from the department's briefing there's a number of areas around early education, early years and childcare that members will be able to cover. So I'll just let witnesses come through.
Very well.
If I can just say, that panel, there were some of the people in the row behind were also contributing, which was super helpful. So the witnesses are going to come back to the committee about Irish medium resources and projects for Sure Start, and also about a pilot that's currently being rolled out in the Falls and the Shankill on smoking and pregnancy.
So that's what that.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just let officials get seated. So just without the deputy chair here, I'm just going to ask members to indicate, and we'll come in whenever they wish. So please do catch my eye, and we'll go from there. Okay, so thank you for joining us today. I'll do introductions, but as always, I caveat it. It has been known that job titles, there's some slippage in communication, so if anything's wrong, do correct me. We have today from the department Paul Brush, Director of Early Years, Childcare and Children and Young People Strategy within the department. We have Tina Dempster, Head of Early Learning and Childcare Strategy Team in the department, Linda Drysdale, Head of Early Years Intervention Programmes Team in the department, and Christine Leacock, Head of the Preschool Education Team and lead on the standardisation element of that, again from the department. So you're all very welcome, and thank you for giving the committee your time. I would just emphasise we do have another big agenda item after this one. There's going to be considerable interest from members in the item. We really did rigidly stick to our timings in the last session and are still over time. So it's just in terms of asking members to work with me to be succinct, to get to questions quickly, and again for officials, I will come in if there's repetition or if we're not getting to answers quickly. So I think in the interest of everybody getting the opportunity to really get into the issues that they're interested in, I would ask that we be succinct. I don't mean over unnecessarily brief, but succinct. That would be helpful. So hand over to yourselves for an initial presentation or opening remarks, up to 10 minutes, and then we'll move to contributions from members, and I would ask that they would be in the 5 minutes per member space if possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to provide an update. I will keep my opening remarks reasonably brief, but there's a few issues I just want to cover. I want to start really by very quickly summarising what has been achieved in the last year, as we're meeting here at the end of the 24-25 year, which signalled a really significant expansion in this area, and I just want to highlight some of the key things. You've just before us had a session with the Sure Start managers. One of the main things that I think we should really be proud of is the amount that has been spent in consolidating and stabilising a range of core existing programmes that we have in Northern Ireland that, to be honest, are the envy of other jurisdictions, and Sure Start is one of those. And you will have no doubt heard from them, 10% increase last year, really stabilised their workforce, injected a level of confidence
into that whole programme. And of course, that was about 3 million, but there was already 30 million being invested by the department, so their overall budget last year in the region of 33.7 million. So an important investment. There's a whole range of these. That's the one that often hits the headlines. There's the Pathway Fund as well that got significant additional investment last year. But I just want to mention the names of a few others because I don't know that there's always a level of visibility. Playboard had additional funding. The Department for Communities Childminding Academies had additional funding, and they were taking people from economic inactivity, putting them through childcare training, and they're now actually functioning childminders. A really interesting and innovative programme. The Department of Health Fair Play Grant Scheme, supporting families with children with additional needs. The Preschool Education Inclusion Fund, this was a brand new fund set up to support preschools that have children before they have a statement of educational needs, so they don't automatically attract any additional funding. But yet those settings are struggling often to cope with the additional challenges. So a fund was put in place to support those settings. Altram Speech and Language, Outdoor Communication in the Irish Medium, extra funding for that. Book Start, you're all aware of. Women's Aid, Helping Hands, and there are more. I don't intend to go into them all, but of course we could provide a full list if you wish us to do so. And I think that it was a really strategic investment across these. This is setting the basis on which the future strategy will be built. The other big achievement in the past year, which everybody is aware of, I think, is the Northern Ireland Childcare Subsidy Scheme, which was introduced from scratch. Parents have benefited from about 8 million in savings, and I won't go into any more details on that. You can ask questions about it if you wish to do so. Sufficient to say that the Minister has committed to continuing it next year. He has signalled an initial increase in the cap. We obviously will keep under review that cap, looking at how fees increase between March and April, as we know there will be some increases specifically at that period of time. A big increase in preschool expansion, like this is probably one of the most lasting legacies that there will be in all of this. It's an ambitious programme, but we're on track to deliver the first 106 this September. Over 2,000 new places, 2,500 children will get a full-time place who would not otherwise have done so this September. And the Minister's keen to obviously maintain that momentum as we go forward. I just wanted to mention at that point, I'm sure obviously you're all aware of the current admissions process for preschool, and I just wanted to mention a few points before moving on to the other achievements of the past year. We're at the stage where really the end of stage 1 of that admissions process, and you'll be aware of the error last week that caused a lot of anxiety for parents in that notifications issued a week early, and you're well aware of the apologies that have been issued and the reasons for behind that. In addition to that, and perhaps heightened a bit this year because we're in a year of transition, we're moving, as I say, a lot of settings to full-time. That has impacted the preferences that a lot of parents have submitted. Full-time is hugely popular, and Christine can go into some of the details in terms of how we've noticed those changes in preferences. But it's most important just to set in context where we're at. 97% of children do now have an offer of a place. So while of course there's a lot of concern and quite understandable anxiety amongst those families that don't, and there are issues in local areas, and the EA is still working through those. We're not at the end of the process. And where required, additional numbers will be added to PAN allocations. I think it's just important to put in context the scale of what has been achieved and acknowledge the need to continue to work in those areas where there are issues. Now, the Minister has actually asked the EA to conduct a fundamental review of the PAN allocation process. I think he, over recent months, has been very much aware of, I suppose, the uncertainty that preschool providers have as being part of this year on year. It's challenging, undoubtedly, for them in that they don't know how many preschool places they're going to have. That's essential to some extent in that we need flex in the system. but we don't diminish the challenge that creates for those providers. So he has written to the EAA asking them to look at this in some detail. So just moving on then to the other key achievements in the year just past. A major data collection exercise initiated. The results of the NISRA survey are due to issue very shortly on the 6th of May? The 8th of May. So that's going to be a major additional contribution, which we will all obviously be using to develop the new strategy. In addition to that, we're also expecting this month the outcome of the review that the Department for the Economy has commissioned into early years settings and the challenges, the sustainability challenges that they're facing. That report is now available in draft, and we're hoping that the results of that will find their way into the public domain within the next few weeks. So it has been quite a significant year of change. It is another, I suppose, looking forward into 25-26, we see that as another year of transition towards a full strategy. We are still on course to produce a full strategy for the autumn. The challenge will be for the Minister to ensure that the momentum is maintained. As you know, he's a budget hopefully of 55 million. He has just signed off on an executive paper setting forward his proposals on how that 55 million would be spent. It is important to say that we had 25 last year, we have 55 this year. That does not mean he can do twice as much as he did last year, because a lot of these initiatives only came on stream in September. So, for example, the Childcare subsidy scheme, we ended up paying for 7 months of it. He'll need to pay for 12 months of it this year. So there is a plan in place. There's a proposal that will go to the executive. The executive will consider that, and once they have done so, the funds hopefully will be released to the department, and we can take that forward. Chair.
Thank you, Paul. Look, there's such a range of issues here. Members will be picking up on different areas. I want to go sort of back to the preschool education programme issues that you raised. And I probably don't want to labour any of the points around admissions. An error was made. It had caused a lot of stress and upset for parents, and I think that we're working through that. I wanted to really get to that issue. You mentioned the review that the Minister has instructed the EA to undertake in relation to the PAN numbers, or the pupil allocation number, to make sure I get that right. Maybe for anyone tuning in, it's not maybe an acronym everyone's familiar with. Every year I get a huge amount of contact from non-statutory preschool providers. It has definitely been increased this year in terms of the sense of that instability that you referred to, Paul, and around the fact that from year to year providers don't know what their plan will be, so they don't know how to plan financially. There are expectations within communities that certain settings will be able to accommodate them, and then they may find overnight that that's not the case. And there's also been an issue raised to me around the sense of potentially being stuck in a loop of your PAN being reduced and you can't get out of it because it is based on the October figures, is my understanding, and then settings wonder how can we grow if we're stuck on an allocations number that has now been reduced. And there's a rurality issue that is raised regularly in my constituency around some of the distances, particularly if public transport is involved, that parents would be expected to travel with a very young child to access a preschool place. So look, those are all of the issues. I suppose, and I don't want to be flippant, and I'm not trying to be flippant. Some preschool providers in the non-statutory space would describe to me they feel a little bit like they're being asked to provide it on the cheap. High standards, and it has to be as good and deliver the same curriculum, but a little bit of we're the junior partners here and we're never going to get what a statutory setting gets. So that's the context. And I've just done what I ask all my members not to do, which is a very long preamble, so please forgive me.
Well done, Chair.
The question, I'll hold my hands up. The question really at this stage is, for me, is where is the policy actually held? So where can we see how a PAN number is allocated, or is it just is it done by some other mechanism? Because I'd asked a ministerial question, didn't get that back clearly. I think other members have as well. Is it legislation? Is it policy? And if it's policy, where is it written down? Where can we see it?
Well, yes, you go ahead.
I mean, the short version is that, because I know you want us to be brief, Chair, that the PAN allocation numbers are set by a group called, it's the Education Authority's Preschool Education Group. That group is comprised of representatives from right across the preschool sector, so providers themselves and their umbrella bodies. They make those decisions. In terms of how they reach those decisions, this year they've actually written out to all providers to set out the framework for how both the initial PAN allocation is made, and I think I do need to stress that it is an initial PAN. It does change throughout the year, and they've also provided some information as to how that would change and when that would change as the process goes on. There's absolutely room for improvement. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, including that group themselves. And
is there a policy? So just again, so that a non-statutory provider, when they get their PAN, can understand, okay, I know that PEG has a process and there's an engagement, it's not a million miles away from an area planning type process. Understand that's complex, but is there an overarching policy around where does statutory provision sit, where does non-statutory provision sit? There's a 5 mile radius that is always quoted as that's the magic number. That sense, your next year's PAN will be allocated based on October census figures. Is this written down somewhere? Because it feels opaque to me, and I don't like it when settings are coming to me asking, well, how has this been worked out? And sometimes you're left saying, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly no intention for it to be opaque, and I think to give the Education Authority their dues, I think the letter that they sent to all settings in February was an attempt to try and give clarity without burdening anybody with reams and reams of information as to how that process works and how those numbers are arrived at.
Is there a written
yes, as
policy?
I say, it's set, and we can share that. It's been put into the library, and we can certainly
and is
write
that's the letter, or is that a
yes.
policy? It's an official policy statement or document?
I would have to ask the EA in terms of this is an internal process to the EA, so I would need to check with them in terms of where everything's written down, but certainly the details are within that letter.
Feedback that EA give is always, we're just implementing the department's policy. That is the line that comes back with every query. This is a department, we don't own this, it's the department's policy. Is that the case?
In terms of the responsibility to secure sufficient preschool provision, that's a legislative duty on the EA.
But the policy of how you arrive at a PAN allocation and how that is measured against statutory provision in the area, is that a departmental policy?
That's an EA policy.
Okay, so when we're advised by the EA, we're just implementing departmental policy when we're handing out the PAN, that's not accurate.
I haven't seen the wording, so I'm not sure. I would imagine probably what they mean by that is the fact that the statutory process, development proposals by which statutory settings are given their admissions number and their enrolment number comes through the department. So that part of the process is outside of the EA's hands. I imagine that's probably what they're referring to, but without seeing what they've written, it would be unfair to comment.
I just want to emphasise, I think the non-statutory providers deliver some really excellent provision, really excellent provision. I think they are doing it on a very, very different budgetary position than a statutory or a standalone nursery school would be. They don't have the luxury of being funded for non-target age children, which again is a source of great frustration to them. How can they compete if they're having to say to a parent, you can pay and come to ours, or you can get that for free down the road? But again, that might be the setting in someone's own community that they really want to attend, and I think they are often really community-based settings. So I just want to put that clearly on record. We would hope, and it would be great if we could see the scope of that EA review. I would love to see that, a real wholesale review, so that there's a sense of equity, and that in keeping with the independent review's recommendations, that those non-statutory settings don't feel that they're just being asked to deliver this on the cheap. Because they don't provide a poorer service, but they're not resourced in the same way to deliver.
On that point, the Minister has invested more in non-statutories in the last year than ever before, and on some measures they are now on a par. But I take your point around all those other
compete with wages
costs.
And staffing in terms of those issues.
And of course, standardisation was always to be about more than just standardising the number of hours. And the report that we had produced at that point looked at all the other areas that would need to be standardised across both statutory and non-statutory. And the aim would be to incorporate that, a plan for that within the early learning and childcare strategy. So, those things haven't been forgotten about. It's just there's been a prioritisation of an element at this point.
I absolutely understand. I suppose I'll just finish with the last point in terms of standardisation, and maybe to just ask a question to broaden it out to that. And obviously it has created a bit of flux in the system and in terms of admissions and all that, and I appreciate that presents challenges. That scenario where statutory settings are being funded, often significant numbers for non-target age children, is that something that you would like to see phased out? Because Sure Start would have very much emphasised they think those non-target age children could be much better served in a different setting. And just in terms of the department's resources, is that the best use of resource to fund non-target age children in the preschool programme?
I think the answer is clearly no, it's not the best use.
Why do you do it?
Well, at the moment, there's a statutory requirement. We would need to change legislation to do it. And until there was we looked at this a few years ago, and until there was an alternative 2-year-old provision in place, the view was it would be difficult to withdraw what was already serving the needs to some extent, but accepting not appropriately for some children. And the need for a 2-year-old programme has clearly been recommended within the independent review. Sure Start has a 2-year-old programme. We obviously are very interested in that model, but there are other models for 2-year-old programmes, all of which will be considered within the strategy.
Belfast-wide early years as an
Absolutely.
example. So in terms of the strategy, which you've said, Autumn, will we be seeing the plans around the 2-year-old programme emerging from that?
Absolutely.
Okay, no, that's great, thank you. So I've had a few indications, please. Anyone else who hasn't come in? Michelle, I'll bring you in first.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think I couldn't possibly not comment on the chaos that's going on in communities at the minute, and from providers and from parents. I don't know if you can comment on this, but I've been told that the decision around stage 2 is not going to be made until the 2nd of June, and parents won't find out until the 10th of June, which feels just ridiculously late for anybody to make any plans. Are you aware of that, or do you think that's appropriate for parents in terms of getting organised for the new term?
I'm not sure what the 2nd of June date is, but certainly the 10th of June is the published timetable for the end of stage 2. That would be consistent. I think it's actually slightly earlier this year, although we need to check that than it usually is. But the preschool admissions process is a 2-stage process and always has been. So that is in line with the published timetable.
Okay, just honestly, the feedback we're getting at the minute is really horrendous from people. They're very distressed about this. The other thing that people are obviously distressed about at the minute is the cost of childcare. Obviously, with your work with the budget that you're working with now and the childcare strategy itself, I just want to understand what kind of modelling you've done in terms of expanding the childcare subsidy scheme out and uplifting the amount of support that families are receiving.
Well, that's obviously a consideration the Minister has been looking at, both for the year ahead to see what he could afford to do, if anything, in that respect. But then obviously a further plan will be incorporated within the strategy. So there's a sort of 2-stage consideration. As I said, when he took his proposals in May of last year to the Executive to say this is what I can do for 25 million, he said at that point in the Executive paper, just to continue these next year will cost over 50 million. So the 50 million is spot on in terms of maintaining. He obviously wants to show a maintaining of momentum as well. So he has been considering what else he could do, and he has put proposals to the Executive. But the longer term development of the scheme to a point where he would like it to get to will have to take place within the strategy.
So, for example, expanding provision to school-age children, would that be?
He has been considering that. That would be an option.
Yeah, that's one of the models that you're doing.
That's been it. Yes, and we've costed all of these different options for him.
Okay, and then connected to that is the increase in costs to providers and the increase of childcare. How are you monitoring that, and how are you tracking what that looks like for families?
Well, we, having introduced the Northern Ireland Childcare Subsidy Scheme, we now have the actual bill details for the 15,000 families that are claiming the scheme. So for the first time, we have very comprehensive data on what their bills are every month, and we will see what their bills, what changes in their bills from March to April. Now, between September and March, there wasn't really any significant increase in bills, which you might expect because that's not the period when most bills are increased. But we will be tracking it very carefully between March and April. So we have a really impressive source of information, and indeed we will be looking to potentially releasing some of that data, possibly even this side of the summer. That data also shows us how many of those parents are hitting the cap or exceeding the cap, how much they're exceeding the cap by, what level of childcare they're using. Are they using full-time childcare? Are they using part-time childcare? And this will be supplemented with the NISRA survey, which, as I say, is due out at the beginning of May. So we have a number of really important pieces of the information jigsaw coming together over the next few months.
Just to close off, when we were talking about obviously the difficulty this year with the PAN numbers and people getting places, I think in the Chamber this week, one of the Minister's colleagues tried to suggest that the problem and the reason why people weren't getting places was because places have been allocated to families on benefits. Does that indicate you're looking at all a change in that criteria?
Well, that is in legislation that children from socially disadvantaged circumstances have to be given priority. About 3 or 4 years ago, the then Minister of Education consulted on removing this. It was introduced at a time really when there wouldn't have been enough places, full stop, for every child. So you wanted to give preference to children from socially disadvantaged background. That's no longer the case. There is a place for every child. Having said that, at that point, it was apparent that there wouldn't have been the level of support to remove it, while there was a significant disparity in terms of some children getting full-time provision and some getting part-time provision. So the move to give every child 22.5 hours will remove the need for that criteria.
Would that be an unfair characterisation then of the position right now?
Well, it's an accurate characterisation in that if you have children from socially disadvantaged background, they will get preference in the allocation of places.
But it's not necessary.
Whether it's right or wrong is a different factor.
And it can't be determined that that's universally happening. Everybody who didn't get a place can't point to that criteria as being a reason.
No, that's not why everyone's not getting a place, but it clearly is a key factor in who gets a place when there is over provision. Fair point.
I think it's important to bear in mind that every preschool setting has that criterion. So you're absolutely right in saying that everyone who didn't get the first preference can't point to that because every setting has exactly the same preference at number one.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We do make a lot in this committee around the vital role of early years and preschool provision in terms of targeting those children in the most disadvantaged areas. I would certainly caution against any major overhaul of that approach, but maybe a conversation for another time. Kathy, you'd indicated next.
I just want to echo that I would have very serious concerns about looking at that criteria as well. The point of that was for protection of those children, but like Chair said, it's maybe for another time. Paul, you mentioned something there in your opening statement where you said where required additional numbers to PAN allocations will be increased. So does that mean that those providers, and I have reams of emails as you can imagine from parents and providers where, I'll give you an example, one has a capacity to take 48. They have had 43 first preference, but their PAN allocation is 27. Well, like you mentioned there, where they need to be jigged about, will that provider?
I'm not going to be able to comment on that provider, and it's not about their capacity, it's about the need in the area.
Well,
and
43 first preference places would show that there is a need.
Yes, but there could be alternative capacity in that area. I don't know that particular situation. So, and of course, what we have had to, and the EA have had to try and guard against this year is obviously settings moving to full-time. I don't know if that's one, have been inundated with applications.
And Paul, sorry, because I don't want to get down that rabbit hole. You mentioned there about the standardisation as well, and you said it's been very popular. How has this not been preempted that this would happen? Because preschool principals have all seen months ago that when this process was happening, that this is what was going to happen. that we would have this setting off against each other. So how is this not being preempted?
But in a sense, it has been preempted, and that's why the EA have held the line and are not filling to capacity all those settings that have standardised, because that would have a detrimental impact on those settings that are still waiting to be standardised. And the Minister had said it at the outset, as we go through it, we're not able to do everybody at the same time. So that will mean at various points in the process, some settings will be more popular than others. But we can't effectively, if you like, give them all the places they could potentially take, because that would knock others out. They might even go under.
From a parent's point of view then?
I appreciate there are frustrations for parents. There are frustrations for parents. No one's ever had their first, not every parent gets their first preference application. And that's never been the case.
That it's not always going to, but there seems to be, I can't understand how this hasn't been preempted and why it's so chaotic this year.
Well, do you want to get some of the figures? Because I'm not sure that it's as chaotic as some are saying. I
would say some of our constituency offices would say different.
And we've had a lot of correspondence, and I'm not saying there aren't issues, but I think it's important to put those in perspective.
I think it's worth pointing out at the start that when a setting mentions the maximum number of children they can take, that's talking about their registration number with health. That's not necessarily a number that they've ever had in terms of the preschool programme. Most settings this year have received the same number of children as they had last year, give or take. Now, lots, particularly those that are full-time, are massively oversubscribed, some for the first time ever, and are very, very keen, naturally, of course, to take as many children as possible. I mean, just to touch on the figures, I mean, we looked at this the other day. For the 106 settings that are standardising this year, they received 2,579 total applications last year, not just first preference, total. This year, that's 9,314. So they're hugely oversubscribed, massively. If the EA were to give every place that all of those settings could take, other settings would not be able to open their doors, and ultimately preschool children would end up with no place, full-time or otherwise.
And
there's the balancing act there.
I understand that, but that's not the case in every scenario. We have issues coming into all our constituency offices where that's not the case. It's not going... Giving children access to one is not going to close another one. You know, we have parents who are sitting with no places. We have parents who are maybe having to travel 20 miles down the road to the next setting. So I know there has to be flexibility. How will that flexibility be rolled out, or how will those decisions be made? How do providers know now that there will be a common sense approach and parents to where their child can be placed?
So the preschool...
Short. I know, I'm going to apologise to say
so
that.
As short as I can make it, it's a two-stage admissions process. That's what stage 2 does. EA do and will change PAN numbers where it's necessary. So where you're suggesting, you know, if there's no provision in 20 miles radius, of course they will increase the numbers.
And just briefly, Chair, and look, there's so much, as you know, that we could be asking here. I want to pick up on what Michelle was saying there around the affordability and the increase that a lot of parents have faced in their childcare costs at the minute, and I really welcome the data collection, but it's okay to track that and it's okay to have that information. It's what is going to be done with that. How are we not going to be in a scenario again where we're giving parents the support yet prices are being increased? You know, it seems like it's just going to be a cycle. So how do we combat that?
We are pretty much out of time, so answer as best you can in a really sort of short sort of sentence, and then maybe for another member to pick the cost issue up, which I know a lot of people watching today will want to hear about.
And we are conscious that that is a risk, and that therefore the strategy needs to consider what measures might be put in place to curb fee increases in the longer term. But obviously there are pros and cons, and there are levels of intervention involved in. That's an option, but I think there are other options, and those are the issues that we need to look at over the longer term.
I'll bring the next member in, and again, I think there's definitely an issue there. I think it would be worth exploring further if other members do want to pick that up. Danny, you're in next.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I was just wondering, how will early intervention feature in the childcare strategy?
Well, the early learning and childcare strategy will be all about early intervention and the value and the benefit of it, and taking one area children with special educational needs and additional needs. Like, we've started that in the examples that I gave earlier, an intervention in preschools for children that have not yet had a STEM statement, and recognising the impact that it can have if you actually start to support those children earlier. Like, another little project that we've funded this year is one, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy, producing resources that all settings will be able to use, and that will be able, like, sometimes you don't need professionals involved at these early stages to address some of these issues. So the strategy will be infused with this focus on intervening early and ensuring that children in those settings have the support they need. This is why the whole SEN work of the department interfaces with this. They're not two completely separate pieces of work. There's clearly an early years dimension to the SEN agenda, and that will find its way into the strategy. We would expect to, if you like, incorporate some of the proposals and recommendations that they have produced around early years within this strategy.
And that's great to hear, right? So I'm going to give you two examples, and it just came into my office. Well, one would obviously be last year because of preschool places. But on Monday, I sat down with a parent who's now leaving work because in their childcare setting, and she's not blaming the provider, the support there for her child with additional needs isn't there, and she's been asked to try and find another place. She can't. So she's going to have to leave work. So where does that fit into the strategy for childcare providers? And then we talk about preschools. The amount of parents last year who got a place and had children with special educational needs ended up on a reduced timetable. That continues on throughout their life in school as well, where that's going into P1 or P2. So how does that be addressed and all that? Because it all sounds good, and this is not me being pessimistic or anything like this, but I do hear a lot of great words and a lot of great strategies, but when it comes to the operational side of it, it's again failure, because it's the parents who come to us and go, I'm on my own, I need support, and it's not there.
I know this is challenging. One area that the Minister supported this year was the DOH Fair Play Grant. Tina, do you want to mention?
Yeah, there was additional money provided to the Fair Play Scheme, which is the Department of Health scheme, and they fund some of that, and we provided additional funding for that, and that is specifically to support childcare providers with children with additional needs, and that is run on a yearly basis, and we haven't enhanced that. 83 extra providers came in last year supporting 338 children, and that is one of the measures. So we work very closely with our Department of Health colleagues who do fund childcare providers. They fund them for training, they provide free training, they'll fund places, they will support them in their running. So we are working very closely with health.
But them outworkings then will go into this strategy to make sure that this is happening year on year, the improvements. Because Sure Start went just before, and they actually see it and identified again, reduced timetables. They're saying you're putting a kid in that we know will not last in this classroom, and then they're out. So are we going to end that practice? Because that's what's happening.
Well, as I said, one of the aims of the strategy is the child development. Children are at the core of this strategy as well, and so that does require us to work with our health colleagues, because we are dealing with the early years, even before the child enters into preschool. So yes, that collaboration, that working, how can we improve that? It is an ongoing process, and there is good work going on in that area.
And that's brilliant. And what I suppose I'm trying to get at, it's important that then continues throughout, and it's not the low-hanging fruit in a couple of years' time when pilot schemes just disappear, and if it's not in the strategy and being delivered, then we're going to have the same problems.
No, look, it will be in the strategy, there's no doubt about that. The question ultimately will be the level of funding that the executive commits to the strategy. The Minister has said he will bring forward an ambitious strategy. We know what we need to do in many of these areas. There are examples of very good programmes in place.
Paul, that worries, and all due respect, sorry, Chair, well, that worries me as well, because you're saying I have this big ambitious policy. Look, I said this earlier on, we could plaster this room with policies, with strategies, with reports across the board, but it has no tangible differences because it doesn't get there on the operational side, and we're going to sit here in a year's time and go, well, we just didn't fund it, so no change. Come on, I don't think that's good enough to be blunt.
Yeah, just a brief response, Paul.
What I'm saying is there will be very clear practical recommendations in this strategy. So it won't be just full of words, it will be very clear practical recommendations and costs. And it has to be for the executive to decide how they prioritise the funding available to them.
We will see. Thank you.
Peter, you had indicated next.
Sure, thank you very much. Chair, I'll sort of stay with money. And I just wanted to check one thing on the way through there that you mentioned, Paul. And it's been talked a lot, the preschool education standardisation programme. In order for that to continue running, was the figure you quoted 50 million for next year? Is that the cost of that programme, or what will that? I suppose the question really is, in order to develop from the 106, I think, providers that have been uplifted, will additional funding be required to, say, double that to 200?
Yes, and the Minister has included in his executive paper what would be required to maintain that level of momentum with a further 100 odd settings next year.
Okay. So just for clarity, that's something that will sit with the executive for funding. So if the executive's priority, leading on from what your answer to Danny was there, if the executive's priority is to further expand the standardisation programme and further expand the hours to 22.5, that will require additional funding?
Yeah, within the 55 million that they've set aside for it. So it's affordable within the plan that he has put forward. And therefore, the objective, when he took the original proposals to the executive this time last year, he made it very clear that if we embark on standardisation, the executive will need to continue to fund this, because you don't want to be doing a bit of it and then stopping, because that we get into the very scenario we've been talking about where some settings are left behind, so to speak. But I suppose you can be assured that it's a priority going forward, and it's affordable within the 55 million. It will be for the executive to decide if they're content with the package that he's proposed.
I keep asking really short questions. We have 106 online. I mean, what is a quantum of how far we have to get, leading on from your answer there about not stopping now because of the differential that Kathy mentioned? How many settings do we still have to sort of transpose? I mean, even roughly, I don't know.
There's 373 settings that are still part-time.
Okay, so that's 25% or sort of done. That's okay, and that just needs to continue. My last question is just again following on from what Kathy said. I've had core from a number of settings. Group support playgroup was one. I assume group support playgroup is probably one of the ones that have gone to 22.5 hours. They have experienced a lot of demand for places, and I'm sitting with quite a few emails in my inbox just regarding that. Is there any scope? We talked about the revision of PAN numbers where there's demand. Is there any general scope for numbers being increased after sort of second tranche, or is that only where there is no capacity in other providers? I suppose is my question. So, can numbers be increased, or is it the case, which I suspect it probably was, that if there's additional provision in other areas within 5 miles, the kids will probably go to those others and fill those places first?
Again, it is an EA process, but I suppose overall the EA will look to balance provision in an area. So if there is sufficient provision to meet the needs of the children in that area, then they won't increase from one setting, which would mean taking away from another, because obviously that could cause the problems that we talked about earlier in terms of a setting potentially becoming unsustainable, closing and leaving other children with no place. But if there's a shortfall in an area, then a PAN can be increased at any point during the admissions process or after.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to raise a point, because I think that Kathy had been asking questions around cost, and I'd sort of closed that down and really in anticipation someone else was definitely going to raise it. I'm really conscious that a lot of people will be watching this today where the childcare cost is very, very much at the forefront of their minds. Could we just pick that up again, because a lot of the feedback we get from parents, and we need to be clear that the investment is welcome, and I think we need to be clear in this. We know that you're a small team who have delivered a lot over the last while, so I think that should be noted. But parents are raising their concern that the benefits of the subsidy scheme are going to be fast outstripped by rising costs. And we all know the huge pressures that childcare providers are under, not least with those wage increases as a result of the national insurance, employer national insurance increases coming down the line. Can you give us any sense of what the department can do to try and be responsive to that scenario that is now emerging, that the really good work to deliver the subsidy scheme could be outstripped as we see costs rising? Give us a sense of just how we can respond to that.
Well, as I said, Chair, the Minister has considered options for the spending the 55 million. There's a limited budget here. You know, if we had unlimited resources, you could do very significant increases to the subsidy scheme. Now there's a potential implication for that, in that if you radically increase demand and haven't invested in the supply side, you could create shortages and challenges in that respect. But having said that, resource is the main limiting factor. He has looked at options and he has put a proposal to the executive, and I couldn't possibly, go into the detail of that. It is important, I think, to say that parents who are eligible are still getting 32% reduction on their bill. Now, I know that prices have increased. We will know exactly how much prices have increased whenever we're able to analyse that data. But it remains the case that even on their increased bill, parents will be getting up to the cap 32% reduction. So almost a third, and that isn't where the Minister ultimately wants to go. He wants to go further than that. Whether he can afford to do more, either in the short term or long term, are factors he's been considering.
That's and I do understand that. I suppose it's really just that my question was about just with the budget that you've got and all of the things that you want to do, is there flex there if it emerges that really costs are moving at pace beyond what the subsidy's meeting? For parents watching this to know, is there flex in the system that there could be movement around that subsidy?
Well, the subsidy can be increased technically quite quickly. The question would be around budget. I suppose there's always the potential to go back to the executive for more money later in the year if the scenario that you describe materialised. But that again would be for the executive to decide, is it prepared to prioritise the funding for that specific purpose?
Thank you. And I appreciate I've come back in. I have an indication from Cara. David, are you looking to come in? Yeah. Cara, if you want to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can all hear me. Look, thank you to the panel for being here. Understandably, I think us as MLAs, it has been such a hectic week. I know a number of areas in my constituency, particularly areas that are rural, like Tamnairn, Eglinton and Ballykelly. Parents are looking at driving up to 20 miles to get to the next preschool provider place that they can get. I'm just wondering if you could speak to maybe some of the rural issues that we're seeing with preschool placements and just any discussions that you have had, because I'm mindful the Rural Community Network has actually just started a meeting 1 minute ago to talk about these issues and how they face rural communities. I just think it's really important that we're expressing, I suppose, the frustration from our constituents, particularly in those rural communities.
Yes, I think I mentioned earlier the letter that the EA sent to all settings actually specifies in it that rurality is a specific issue whenever setting the initial PAN allocations and also reviewing them. And the scenario that you mentioned about 20 miles, I mean, if that is the case, the PAN allocation will be changed. There's no doubt about that.
Would you do much engagement then with those kind of rural stakeholders like the Rural Community Network?
In terms of the PAN allocations, that would be for the EA. As I say, it's the EA's PEG group. I'm not sure what level of engagement they have with that specific group. It is, of course, comprised of preschool providers, including rural providers and their representative bodies.
Sorry, if I could just come in. The Rural Network is also a member of the Stakeholder Engagement Forum for the development of the Early Learning and Childcare Strategy.
Yeah, that's brilliant. They've been a really strong voice on this, because I'm just mindful just the level of distress, parents are having. They've been rejected from a number of places. and the kind of financial and just personal disruption. Like some of them were saying there's no point in going to work by the time you drop a child off 20 miles away and return. So yeah, definitely some raised tempers on this matter, and parents just feel a wee bit hopeless and a wee bit helpless. But no, that's good to note. And Chair, that's it for me. Just that point of clarification. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara and David.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks for your presentation so far. I want to acknowledge that I think we all have had a tough week. I think with our busy week, certainly with the inboxes and dealing with some of these issues. I think that frustration in terms of the human error that was made is shared, I think, by the Minister as well. But I do want to recognise that actually a lot of the ones that I've been working on, and I know from others that there have been children finding places as we go through the week. And so hopefully that continues, and recognising that actually some of those children would have been placed already before the announcement if it had come at the right time rather than as it did. So it has been a bit chaotic, but I'm thankful that we seem to be making progress, and I hope that continues. I want to raise probably a Belfast specific issue in that. Could I ask first of all, 5 mile radius, is that legislative or is that policy?
That's an EA policy, although Belfast would be different, being a city area, and they will look at they look at a much smaller radius there. Just 1 to 2 miles, I believe.
Okay, well then you've answered the question that I was about to query. So thank you very much, Chair. That's
no problem at all.
And if you know the lottery numbers for the weekend, Christine, please pass them along.
The best.
I think that's a record from there in terms of timing.
After your long preamble, Chair.
I know, but it was a great preamble. I don't have any other indications, so look, I'm going to bring that evidence session to a close. We do appreciate your evidence today, and I think it has come at a time where there's obviously a significant interest in the strategy development, the issue around costs, but perhaps some of the admissions issues that have arisen have maybe just taken members' attention in that particular direction. That there's likely to be follow-up, and we obviously really do, once perhaps things progress through the executive, and also as we move towards the autumn and the strategy, we'll undoubtedly want to hear from you again. But we thank you for your time this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think at that stage, then members, we really just probably to wrap up the last 2 evidence sessions in terms of any actions that would be arising. So I'm maybe to go through the clerk first for anything, and then for anything else that members want to raise.
I just have that really the officials were going to come back to share the EA's preschool education group policy, so that everyone can have a full understanding of the PAN allocation model. That's all I had, Chair.
No, that's fine. I'll just pick up from the Sure Start briefing, if I can find my notes on that. I think from Sure Start, because we didn't get to pick up maybe as many of their issues as we would like, I think they did reference, I think, very clearly budget sustainability. So I would like to suggest we write to the department just to get clarity on any measures around budget sustainability for Sure Start, and indeed for any of their key community and voluntary sector delivery partners in the early year space. I particularly thought that issue, we have had commentary from the Finance Minister of moving towards a multi-year budget. Is that something the Minister's looking at, and maybe a more of a 3-year budgetary cycle to give some of those settings certainty? So I would like to ask around that. Sure Start particularly raised the issue of getting some clarity on the out of area fund and making sure that's properly resourced. So again, how much resource is going to go into that, because they did reference that it would be an important element of enabling them to have that little bit of flex in their service. In terms of the briefing from the departmental officials, I wanted to just pick up on the preschool side of things, and then very much open up to other members on anything else that they want to raise. I would be really keen to get some detail on the exact scope and detail of the EA review that the Minister has been referencing around the whole approach to allocating pupil numbers in the non-statutory sector, because I think there's so much uncertainty out there. I mean, there's no provider in that space that I speak to who feels that they really do either feel that they've got a proper place at the table on how the decisions are made, or are clear on how it's done. And I think I don't think any of us like uncertainty around key stakeholders, so I would hope there would be agreement around that. And I think there were some issues, I think, around what I would like to suggest we would see in that Cara's points around making sure rural needs are properly addressed, and just really a system that is fair to all providers, including statutory, but that does not leave the non-statutory sector feeling like they're constantly at risk of having to, you know, put staff on notice of redundancy every time this process goes round. It doesn't feel sustainable. So those are the issues I would suggest. Any other members? Kathy, you've indicated there.
Yeah, sure, I agree with all of those. See in particular though around the PAN allocation and that criteria that's used, if we could ask for, because it was mentioned, I think it was quite flippant in some of the remarks there, that there would be flexibility, or you know that they're trying to spread, and I understand that, but there are certain circumstances out there where there are parents who are in real need who just can't travel, or there's specific issues, and there needs to be flexibility. Could we get what the criteria is that the EA use, particularly on those appeals as well, so again, so that we know, even representing our constituents, what will be used when making those decisions. I just think it's really important that we cover that. The other thing, the whenever I know you went back to it there, Chair, around the affordability piece, as well. If we could get some more clarity on that, I know that Paul mentioned that they were tracking and they were getting all this data. Like, parents out there will be able to tell you what the price increases are. What exactly is going to be done with that data then? When will we be able to see it, and what actions will be taken from it?
I think that's crucial, and again, I'm trying to get to that with the question around flexing the budget, because I know Paul is right. You know, it is budget. It depended on budget, but I think it would be good to get some assurances there will be flex built in. That if it becomes clear that this is not actually meeting the needs of parents, of where they're at with cost as they're rising, that if there's some flex in that 55 million, it would be helpful to know. And any other members? Looking, Michelle.
Just in terms of, you've asked about the policy. I think some people have been suggesting, we don't know what the policy is, that the policy has changed from last year to this year. If that's the case, can we understand then, was there rural needs impact statement done, and even Sector 75? Just to understand, are those things factored into this decision making? I
think it is that lack of clarity. I don't feel assured of if there is a policy or not. If there's maybe an internal working document within the EA that is, they interpret as their outworking of departmental policy, but certainly I didn't get the sense the department wanted to own a policy on this. So there is uncertainty. So things like rural needs assessments and all of that will factor in. So yeah, absolutely. Are we agreed on those issues? Is there anything else that members want to raise? I think it was just, look, I know, and we'll come to forward work planning in a little later in the agenda, which will be under a little bit of pressure over the next while, but I do think we would want to make sure that we keep a very close eye on just how things are developing in this space, particularly around tracking those costs and around some of the outworkings of the preschool programme. So I would hope we would hear from these officials again before too long. Okay, members, that is closing off both items 6 and 7 then. So the next item on the agenda is another oral briefing. Can I just check before we bring them in, are members wanted a comfort break at this stage, or are we happy to continue? Short 5-minute comfort break. Okay, well, if we could just move into...
Committee Room 29, Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound.
Yeah, oh yes, please. Yes, please. Okay, members, so that is us back into open session. So it takes us to item 8 on our agenda, and it is the task force report on the development of a proposed model of support for controlled schools. So I'll just let the witnesses take a seat, but I would draw members' attention to the briefing note from the committee clerk at page 109 of their packs, and then the task force report itself, which is at page 111 of your packs. So welcome our witnesses. Today we have Mark Baker, the Chief Executive of the Controlled Schools Support Council, and we have Andrew Scott, the Director of Corporate Services and Governance at the department. So the purpose of the briefing today is really to report on the task force report and for members to have the opportunity to ask questions in relation to that. So I'll invite you at this stage to make any opening remarks that you wish to, up to 10 minutes. Then we'll move to question and answer. We're aiming to 5 minutes per inquiry for members. So as with previous session, myself included, let's get to questions quickly and for witnesses again to be succinct, but to cover the issues. Over to yourselves.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the invitation to come today. So I'm here today with my colleague Andrew Scott from the department, who was a member of the task force with me, and I'm here wearing 2 hats, which is always useful, isn't it? I'm the chair of the task force and I'm the chief executive of the Controlled Schools Support Council, as the chair has said. So the recommendations made in the task force report are about ensuring that controlled schools, which are 49% of our schools, serving diverse communities across Northern Ireland, receive the focused, effective support and challenge they need to provide the best possible education for the 42% of our children and young people who attend them. The controlled sector is diverse, including nursery, primary, secondary, grammar, integrated Irish medium and special schools. And most importantly, it is the only sector that has the Education Authority as its managing authority. As you know, the Independent Review of Education report, Investing in a Better Future, identified the significant challenges facing the controlled sector. The report highlights suboptimal arrangements for controlled schools. The review specifically noted that controlled school principals believe that the EA is currently stretched too thin in its role as managing authority, trying to service all school types, which has left controlled schools feeling relatively unsupported. In response to these findings, in September 2024, the Minister established the task force to identify solutions to provide more effective and equitable support for the sector. I was asked to chair this task force and was privileged to accept, working alongside senior representatives from the Education Authority and the Department of Education, and it is important to take the opportunity to thank our colleagues in EA and the Department for the work. All schools, regardless of sector, should be effectively supported. The task force report addresses the specific challenges identified for controlled schools, but the ultimate goal is equity and excellence throughout Northern Ireland's education system. Controlled schools have faced challenges for a number of decades, and these decades predate the Education Authority. This has not been about the people, both in EA and CSSC, who have worked diligently to support their schools. It's a result of the suboptimal form and function of both organisations. As part of the task force process, we engaged with a principals reference group and extensively with our sectoral partners, including the Council for Integrated Education and Calling the Girls School Iachta, as the controlled sector includes controlled integrated and Irish medium schools. We also engaged with the Governing Bodies Association, the Transfer Representatives Council, the trade unions, and specifically with the Council for Catholic Maintained Schools as the other managing authority. Given the urgency of addressing these challenges, the task force operated under a tight time frame, completing our work in December 2024. Through our consultations and the EA survey of controlled school leaders, several key areas of need were identified. A clearer sectoral vision and more coherent, proactive leadership, improved tools and support for school improvement, proactive rather than reactive support for schools, and support tailored to individual school contexts with a strong focus on standards. It also called out enhanced collaboration and a coordinated multidisciplinary approach to effectively address challenges. It is important to note that in the independent review, there is a significant focus on the fact that if you look at the data since 2012, Catholic maintained schools have outperformed controlled schools by between 8 and 12.6 percentage points, despite higher levels of free school meal entitlement in Catholic maintained schools. So that's a significant difference in outcomes at Key Stage 4. And I know committee has heard of that before and has received evidence of that before. Of the 13 schools identified in the independent review as overperforming relative to the proportion of free school meal entitlement, only one is a controlled school. So we need to ensure the challenge and support arrangements for controlled schools are the best that we can make them. So there are two solutions that are put forward, two recommendations in the report. Recommendation number 1 is a controlled schools unit, which is an interim collaborative model established within the Education Authority's Education Directorate. So the Education Authority remains as the managing authority. It's designed to facilitate tangible improvements in the short to medium term, bringing together key service areas under their managing authority remit, including school governance, school improvement area planning and leadership development. Fostering closer collaboration between the EA and CSSC through a formalised agreement and enhanced collaborative working is key, focusing on providing relational rather than transactional support with an emphasis on being proactive rather than reactive. The establishment of cross-service, locality-based, phase-specific teams to ensure coordinated support underpin the work. So that phase 1 can happen almost immediately. And the Minister has been quite demanding in insisting that it is operational on the 1st of September, which is quite tight time frame, but work is underway for that to move forward. Phase 2 is what is called MAX in the report, Managing Authority for Controlled Schools, a dedicated standalone body with managing authority responsibilities, developed to provide a primary focus on governance and strategic leadership, requiring primary legislation to transfer identified duties and functions. It establishes a body that can stand alone alongside and collaborate effectively with education partners. It will develop a sector-specific vision and strategy to address the unique needs of controlled schools. So ultimately, the controlled schools unit, combined with the CSSC, moves into a standalone body, MAX. It's always good to have a good acronym, is it not? On February the 3rd, 2025, the Minister accepted these recommendations and spoke subsequently at a conference of controlled schools leaders where the recommendations were very positively received. The Minister requested, as I've said, that the CSU be operational for the new school year. The task force remains in place as an implementation oversight group. Controlled school leaders have discussed the lack of understanding more widely of the vision and purpose of controlled schools and the need for a resetting of how the sector presents itself to reflect its focus on serving diverse communities. The non-denominational Christian values that underpin the sector embrace inclusivity. Our schools must continue to serve the changing communities in which they are embedded. This work will not be a panacea for all educational challenges, however it represents significant improvements that can help controlled school leaders focus on their core function, ensuring the safety, well-being and educational achievement of children and young people across our communities. Chair.
Thank you, Mark. I visit a lot of schools, speak to a lot of principals across sectors. I'm not even just in my own constituents, I visit a lot of schools. Can you help me understand what the specific issues are that impact controlled schools in ways that don't in other sectors? Because no matter what sector I speak to, the issues that come back tend to be the same. And some of them you've mentioned in getting support with school improvement, that the support should be tailored to their school, that it should be timely support from the EA, that there should be the right collaborative approach within the EA to deliver services. Many of the services the EA provide are shared services for all sectors. I've never heard a controlled principal that I've been in the room with say, I think I get a raw deal as a controlled principal. They say, I think the EA doesn't provide services in a way that I need them to. What's specific? Help me understand what's specific to controlled schools that sets it apart from other sectors.
Well, the fundamental difference is there is a different relationship between the educational authority and controlled schools. So all other sectors are either their own, the individual schools are their own managing authorities and therefore funded slightly differently, and there are challenges with that, and you know that, or they have their own managing authority which provides services itself. So EA is the managing authority for controlled schools. So I think some of the concerns, and many of the concerns, and there are concerns about the universal services that EA provide. And I mean, I think we all know there are significant improvements being made as we speak, actually. But the difference in the relationship is that a managing authority must have an overarching care and support for its schools. And the controlled sector, for a significant period of time, partly because of the history. Remember, if you go previous to the Education Authority, the 5 education and library boards each managed the controlled schools in their locality areas. There's not been a clear, coherent approach to supporting and challenging controlled schools.
Just then to pin that down a bit more clearly. What areas, because the Minister has said that he believes the EA has failed controlled schools. So where have controlled schools been failed by the EA in ways that maintained schools have not, or grant maintain integrated or voluntary grammars have not?
Can I address, and my colleague Andrew, can I address the failed word? Not always.
It's the Minister's
yeah,
words.
I'm not going to disagree that controlled schools have been failed. We're not talking about the people in EA, and I think it's really important. And I know you're not either. And I know the
clear on that in
ministers
all my
aren't
comments
either.
in the EA.
No.
There's lots of good people in the EA, very good people, but there's not a lot of resource.
And I spent a lot of time working in EA, and they're my colleagues, and I work with them today. So that's not the system has failed controlled schools. So controlled schools are 49% of our schools. They are. I'll stop waving my pen at you, Nick. So the controlled sector is a diverse sector. 49% of our schools are being let down because there's not a clear, coherent focus on developing leadership for the sector, the pathways for leadership. There's not a clear, consistent process around really embedding what is an inclusive ethos across the sector. And two of the most fundamental things in improving schools, and you had evidence recently from the Fair Start report group, two of the most fundamental things in any school, in improving a school, are leadership development and embedding the ethos. One thing that CCMS, for Catholic maintained schools, since their inception in 1989, has been very clear and very successful in doing, is embedding the ethos within the schools, but not just in the schools, more widely in the communities around the schools, because the school cannot work alone. It's the communities around the school they need to work in, and developing the leadership. That means challenging the leadership when it needs to be challenged, but nurturing and supporting it. So the real challenge is, since its inception, EA's focus has been on providing high quality, universal services to all schools. And I applaud that, and I was part of setting that up. The problem is, by treating all schools equally, you're treating the controlled schools inequitably, because the controlled sector has those different needs. And the problem for me as the Chief Executive of CSSC is we have been unable, through our lack of statutory responsibility, to deliver on that. It comes down to leadership, ethos, wider engagement with the communities, and really being a managing authority, which should be showing clear leadership for what the sector is and what Northern Ireland needs controlled schools to be.
I'm struggling to really understand. I think, and I'm going to concede a point. I think when we look at area planning, we all see that there are issues there, and that is an area where the EA, I think, finds itself quite conflicted with its two roles that it has to balance, and I will concede that. On the wider issue around services, I am struggling a bit to see it. You used the phrase, I think, equity and excellence. And I would say that's what we should want for the whole system. So the whole system, equity and excellence. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, would we not be better to move to the independent reviews recommendation, which was a single managing authority for all schools? Is that not what equity would look like, rather than what looks like potentially another layer of bureaucracy?
Chair, I'm happy to pick up on that one, and I think the nub of this comes down to, as Mark mentioned, the distinction between the universal service provision that's there for all schools, or the majority of schools, and that specific role that the EA currently has as the managing authority for controlled schools and only controlled schools. And that's where the independent review, in looking at that, felt that because of the focus on the universal service provision and the resourcing challenges that are there, they felt that the Education Authority was spread too thin, and that led controlled schools unsupported in their role as a managing authority. And that's why the Minister has said he's keen to focus on this area and to create the control skills unit within the EA in the short term, but moving to the longer term separation out of the managing authority responsibilities so that there isn't a conflict between the universal service provision and the managing authority aspects of that. In doing so, I know the Minister was keen to point out that if there is a political will to extend the scope beyond control skills, that's something that he is very much open to.
If we concede the point, and I'm for the sake of the question, concede the point that setting up the unit within the EA may address some of the issues that you've set out, is the next step not then to do that work, to build that consensus and bring us to a single managing authority rather than another staging point with another layer of bureaucracy, when hopefully we would all be on the same page that we need less bureaucracy in education and the single managing authority is where we should be heading?
I think, Chair, certainly the possibility of that can be explored. The Minister is keen that we don't spend an excessive amount of time trying to pursue something and we let that get in the way of actually making a difference in the short term. Again, back to the distinction here, there is a difference for control skills that doesn't apply elsewhere as the system is currently set up. So I think he would want us to pursue making improvements for control skills under the current system, but that doesn't preclude doing that in such a way that enables that to be expanded in future. And I think certainly as officials we will look to make sure we can not rule out those opportunities.
If I might,
I'm going to move to other members because I think these issues will probably there'll be common themes, I imagine. So look, I'll bring in other members in the interest of time. So have we got any indications, Danny?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I suppose going back to the points that the Chair was making, and it was the Minister's words that the Education Authority was failing schools. So would that be your asset? Would you share that view?
I share the view that the form and function of the Education Authority, the way in which it's been set up, has failed controlled schools, yes. Not the individual people, not the staff, but the structures within which they have to work. Having, and my colleague has outlined it, having that universal responsibility to all schools, whilst having a specific focus on one group of schools, has been very challenging to deliver. And so that's the failure.
But we have had the EA themselves in, and they wouldn't agree with that. No, so that's fair enough. And I suppose a follow up on that there would be, would you accept like a criticism that the establishment of another managing authority within our education system, I suppose, impacts the promotion of shared and integrated education?
Well, having spent a significant time at Queen's working and developing shared education, that's the last thing the intention would be. I do not believe this creates any more division than may currently exist, because you've already got a managing authority for controlled schools. So all you're doing is moving that managing authority into a different place, combining it with a body that already exists, the Controlled School Support Council, and aligning it very closely with CCMS. So those two bodies, akin to shared education, can now work very closely together and work together with the other sectoral support bodies. So nothing in the report around a unit or around Max stands in the way of any next steps that, if there's political will to move towards some closer body or a single managing authority, nothing stands in the way of that. The most important thing, and the thing I agree 100% with the Minister and with what the independent review says, is the most important thing is today that underachievement gap is significant. We cannot wait another 7 years. We can't wait another generation of our children and young people who are not being given the opportunities that they should have. Mm-hmm. And so therefore the desire to act now, I think, is really important. I would agree with you, really important, Danny. We mustn't stand in the way of moving into a more closer shared future. That's really vital in terms of where we go. But I don't see, and remember, 32, almost half of the integrated schools are controlled integrated schools. So we're talking about the support for integrated education through this, the management support for the schools and ensuring they're the best schools they can be.
No concerns then? For the duplication, there's no concerns in
no,
your
well, I don't have a concern about duplication, Danny, because whilst I accept this is the creation of another body, that body is being created from two bodies that already exist, and they're being placed into a far more optimal solution, which can work very closely with our colleagues in CCMS and with the others. And that's really vital. And there should be a duty on anybody to work with any other body in our education system. We don't need more division in our society. And shared education and integrated education play a vital part in bringing our children and young people together. And the managing authorities are a fundamental part of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Danny, David, you'd indicated next.
Thanks very much, Chair. I have to say, just on the back of Danny's questions, I'm not trying to be adversarial about it, but I think duplication is a strange word to use for it. I think what we're trying to deliver here is equity for a particular sector, and I think if there was another sector that was the one that was left out, I think that we would have much clearer views than that from around the table on this issue. I think it's I guess what I will start by asking, I think it's been touched on here, and I understand you may be limited in what you want to say on this, but do you detect any, through discussions that you're having, do you detect any enthusiasm or direction at the moment within the sectors to want to move towards a single managing authority?
I don't believe that there's consensus across the sector. No, I don't believe there is.
Yes.
And part of the challenge is, and you will all know this as members of this committee and being local MLAs, our school leaders are focused on one thing: the children and young people in their schools. And they need effective support and they need effective challenge. That's where they are. So a lot of the conversation about there being a single authority, we've had these conversations before. Yes. Those of us who are slightly older than we might like to be remember the conversations about ESA. We've been there before. I wouldn't hold my breath for something swift to happen. Mind you, with the political will, I would think so. This is not about, are there people in the controlled sector who really are pushing towards a single authority? They want the best model of support.
Yes. Absolutely.
There will be people in the sector who do think a single authority is an important way to go. And if there's consensus,
personally, I don't think that the minister's a great blockade to that. I think what it is a realisation of where we are at the moment, and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We may aspire to something in the future which may be very difficult, I suspect, for numerous reasons to deliver. But in the meantime, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have equity in the system that we currently run, and that's not we don't have. And so when we had the First Start panel here previously, and others we've heard this from as well, and I asked, why is it that Protestant young men in particular struggle to attain the same as their equivalents from a Catholic background? Why is it that Catholic maintained schools are doing better than controlled schools in this? And you referred to it. They actually said we've really struggled to identify exactly what that is. This is certainly one area where there's been a differential identified between those two sectors. Do you feel that this is something that, if done right, could really help deliver better outcomes for controlled schools?
I wouldn't, if I might, we wouldn't be doing this, and I wouldn't be supporting this piece of work if I didn't believe it was going to improve outcomes for children and young people. Yeah. This is not about some kind of sectoral desire to have independence of any way whatsoever. That's not what this is about. This is about improving outcomes for children and young people. And the Fair Start group did talk very clearly about the importance of ethos and leadership.
Yes, they absolutely.
And they are fundamental in improving schools. And controlled school leaders deliver on a day in, day out basis. They deliver, against all of the challenges that all of our school leaders are facing. Unfortunately, due to a number of reasons, and the connection with the community and the aspirations of community is part of this. And empowering schools to work with their local communities. And there's the RAISE programme, which has been launched recently, which is a really important programme, I would suggest, in terms of how we link schools into communities. It's really important that we move forward. Remember, CCMS, to a certain extent, did this after 1989. This has been done before. This is not something new. This, as I've said, is not a global panacea. This isn't going to solve all of the problems in education. But what it should have is a clear focus that a managing authority has on the schools it manages and supports, and a clear focus on its responsibility to its sector, but also a clear focus on the responsibility that the governors and the leaders in our school have to their communities, and that the communities have to the schools. So there are ways through all of this, but again, we wouldn't be doing this if this wasn't about children and young people.
Well, it seems to me, yes, absolutely. Well, it seems to me that it's something that CCMS have done very well. We need to learn from them, and therefore our control schools have the right to ask for equity in that, not just for themselves, but for some of those, particularly those underperforming in terms of education, and those in less well-off areas. So I think that's something that we can all get behind. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, David. Don't have any other indications at the moment, Peter.
I'll take one then, Chair. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for this report. It's, in my view, excellent, and I'm really glad to see it, because I do believe quite clearly that our control schools in Northern Ireland need more support, and part of that is along the lines of what you've outlined, Mark, today in terms of leadership, aspiration and ethos. There are duties that the department has for other school sectors in Northern Ireland. Those duties are either to encourage and facilitate, or to encourage, facilitate and support. It's my understanding that those duties apply to all other school sectors in Northern Ireland. Can I ask you, is there any duty on the department regarding control schools?
Be a range of duties on the department that apply to all schools. The duties that you've referred to, there are duties that have been added typically over time since those duties were in place, and they call out those specific sectors and place duties in for those. But off the top of my head, I can't think of a duty that is specific to control schools in that regard.
Okay, so if I reframed the question for you, Andrew, and said, is there a duty for the department to encourage and facilitate control schools in Northern Ireland?
Not in the same way as is written for other sectors.
Or to encourage, facilitate and support other schools in Northern Ireland?
No, only in general terms.
Okay. So I guess you could tell where I was going with this. It is my view that actually, and that other sectors, and we're talking about equity, and my colleague raised that this CSU, and there's a lot of acronyms today, and possibly MAX, is about trying to provide equity in the system, and fairness in the system. And I'm sure that's something that probably everyone on the committee would support. And in terms of the evidence that you presented, Mark, and we've heard it before, Colin Knox did a paper on this and presented it to the committee. I've done my own research on it. You cited a differential of between 8 and 12% in terms of performance between control schools and Catholic maintained schools. And there's been a lot of debate about why that is. Do you feel that these changes, be they a CSU or a MAX, will help start to address that differential gap? And I should say before you answer, it's no criticism whatsoever of the people who are working very hard in control schools and control school leaders. I'm very supportive of those schools. But in terms of specifically addressing that gap, do you think a CSU or MAX will help start to close that gap?
Yes, I do, because I believe that the primary focus of the CSU will be on controlled schools. And the primary focus, without competing priorities, for MAX will be on controlled schools. I don't believe the right questions have been asked previously about the controlled sector. And I mean, it's important to remember Catholic maintained schools, when compared with similar controlled schools, outperform expectations. We need all of our schools to outperform the expectations. And it's also important to remember that controlled schools are, in some people's mind, controlled schools, the moment I say the word controlled, people hear the word Protestant. Mm-hmm. Controlled schools are less than 60% Protestant, significantly others and Catholic now. There are many controlled schools that have a majority Catholic population in the school. So we're not just talking about one part of the community, we're talking about the whole community. And it's really, really important that we learn from all sectors about how we can get better and how we work together. And I share your concern, Peter. This is not a criticism of anybody in the controlled sector, or a criticism of anybody in EA, or a criticism of anyone in the department. This is a time to refocus on 49% of our schools that I do believe have been lost for a period of time. Lost to the point that if we don't act now, I don't know whether we will have a controlled sector moving forward. And that's not what we need in Northern Ireland.
It's worth highlighting
very brief times. Just
we're way ahead of time today. It's great.
There are further items in the agenda.
I know there is, Chair. That actually, in terms of the evidence, I thought it was very interesting, and it's worth getting this on Hansard. 45% of Northern Ireland newcomer pupils are going to controlled schools. People out there wouldn't realise that. I think it's worth sharing that actually nearly half of all newcomer pupils in Northern Ireland are attending controlled schools. In terms of timescales,
right, there's no time for a full answer here, so just straight to the question if I could do a one-line answer.
In terms of timescales and the CSU, do you think this is deliverable within the mandate? And I actually think legislation is crucial on this. Do you think there's any scope for legislation in terms of max within the mandate?
Yeah, in terms of CSU, the intention is, it's a challenging time frame, but the intention is to have it operational by September of this year. That doesn't require legislation, that's just restructuring within the Education Authority. We are working with us in the department.
Because time is out, so
on
September
max,
for CSU.
the Minister's intention is to legislate for it within this mandate. That is a challenging time frame as well, but work is progressing to bring forward legislation on that.
Again.
Thank you. Just a very brief point. I mean, I think I would want to emphasise, and I said this at the start of the meeting, I sit on the board of governors of a controlled school. I think there's sometimes a narrative that members want some sectors to thrive and others not. I don't give up my time voluntarily to support a sector I don't want to see do well. In terms of that differential, and you've highlighted it in terms of the outcomes in the maintained sector and the controlled, we've got to be evidence-led. We're asking public money to be spent on this. Is there objective evidence that setting up a managing authority for controlled schools will close that gap? I mean, I've not seen any academic research on an academic underachievement that highlights that as an action they'd be recommending the department to invest in to tackle that issue. Is there an evidence base?
On that, the best source of evidence that comes to mind for me at the moment is the independent review of education that called out the outcomes experienced in the controlled schools, and they considered that was at least in part due to the management arrangements
they have
around
suggested there may be a connection, so there's a suggested kit, but is there objective? We've got we had a brilliant paper from Colin Knox, and we have an absolute swathe of evidence around how to tackle education underachievement. Does any academic research recommend this to tackle educational underachievement?
Well, Nick, I'm not going to tell you that I have some, but I will go away. But what the research does say is the research talks about the importance of leadership and ethos. And the best way to support leadership and ethos is through a strong managing authority.
No, that's fine. I wanted to ask the question because I don't want sort of cause and effect to become confused sometimes with this, of that, well, this sector's doing better, it therefore must be its managing authority. Is my concern that in terms of we would like to see evidence of that, but very, very briefly, Peter.
Yeah, Chair, I mean, I try to tease out the fact that other sectors in Northern Ireland have duties placed on them to either encourage, facilitate and support. You know, the only sector, and it's come out in evidence today, the only sector that doesn't have that is the sector that we're talking about.
Voluntary grammars?
Voluntary grammars. Voluntary grammars. Evidence also has been presented in terms of the differential, and I just think, for me, there is an issue, and if it was an issue in any other sector, I'm sure the committee would be saying, I'm sure they're saying it in this as well, I want to speak to people, is we need to do something to support controlled schools, because there is very clearly from the evidence today the fact that EA has been pulled in a number of ways, and no other sector is pulled in the same ways as a control sector because of the management authority arrangements with EA.
The question is it the right thing that we're planning to do? And that's the question for a committee to get to an answer on. Michelle, you'd indicate.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your evidence. I was kind of going to ask that question around the cause and effect of improving performance and the management authority, because I don't think there's perhaps a direct read across. I think the right question is to see if there's an evidence base in that. But just the one thing I was going to ask, which I actually thought somebody else would ask, would be about the costs. So there's an estimate of around 1.2 million of recurring costs for the CSU. Then you'll move to the MAC structure. So what will that look like? What will that structure look like? Will you have additional directors, chief executives, all of that kind of structure that will come with it, and what kind of costs are you looking around all of that?
Yeah, and in terms of the max, the detail of that will need to be worked out. I think we'll base the model initially on what is put in place for the CSU, and that's where the 1.2 million figure comes from that. It's too early to say at this stage in terms of the actual cost for max and how that might differ. I would expect, as a separate arm's length body, that it would have some costs associated with that, but the detail of that is yet to be considered.
And if the only thing I would say is, I am a chief executive of the Controlled School Support Council. One already exists as such, and I'm not putting myself forward for any further jobs.
Sure?
Yeah, definitely. I could tell you, I was 60 recently. So and there's nothing wrong with being 60, just to say that. But no, I know you. I was. That was the problem. I'm thinking about my colleagues who are out there in the. But there are already costs related to the support provided to CSSC and the support provided by the CSU. So by bringing those two together, you've already got costs that exist in the system. So whilst there may be some increased costs, I wouldn't see them being significantly different to what's already been spent in the CSU and in CSSC, and bringing those two together.
Okay. Yes, time will tell. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I have no other indications. Colin, are you want to come in? No. So I think the only thing I just wasn't picked up that may be worth asking, just in terms of the engagement you've had. Obviously, the controlled schools are populated by teachers and principals. So in terms of engagement with NITC, who represent education professionals across all sectors, what has their feedback been on the report?
Well, we engage with them in the process. I meet our colleagues in the ITC regularly, and I've actually got a meeting lined up, I believe, with them in the next couple of weeks. Some of their concerns, specifically around max, would broadly reflect some of the concerns raised by members around the table, which is around potentially another layer of bureaucracy, even though I wouldn't perceive it to be another layer, because it already exists. It's a reposition. But again, it's that concern. One of the fundamental concerns, and I would share it, and in fact it's in the task force report, is EA provides a wealth of services to all schools, specifically in the area of employment. And employment is probably, and you can understand why the NITC would be concerned about employment. Specifically in that area, what we don't want to do is to overcomplicate a system and to create a system where there are unintended consequences for other schools. Because the unintended consequence of the form and function of EA is what we're talking about today. But broadly, and I'm being careful about talking on behalf of our colleagues in the NITC, but broadly my understanding is there is the understanding of the unit and the purpose of the unit is more accepted and understood.
Than max. Okay, well, that's helpful. I understand if you were to set max up, you'd be creating a new employing authority, and then obviously the HR.
It's one of the options, Chair, but not necessarily the option.
Sure. No, that's helpful. Look, that brings the evidence session to a close, and thank you for your time. And I probably should have said at the outset, you have been very patient as we have rearranged this session a couple of times as business overtook us. So thank you for working with us on the scheduling on that.
And I thank you for volunteering as a governor in a controlled school chair, and for anybody else around this table who volunteers as a governor in any of our schools. You give of your time, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, guys.
That's great. So that brings us to the end of that item. I'm not aware of any issues for specific follow-up. I think Mark undertook to come back around the academic research piece. Is there anything else that clarity? No. So happy to close that item off. Okay. Look, that takes us on to item 9, members. So I'd refer you to pages 169 to 372 of your packs, where we have correspondence. And as a summary note at page 169, as usual, there was also some additional material in your table papers. I don't have the page references just to hand. So as usual, I'll raise anything that requires committee response or decision. Otherwise, it will be as per the summary note, unless a member wants to raise anything. There's a fair bit of correspondence. It struck me we've been writing a lot to the department, so thanks to the officials who've been dutifully providing the responses, but we'll get through this as quickly as we can. So item 9.2 on page 171 is a response from the Minister of Health providing further information following a briefing by the Chief Allied Health Professions at our concurrent Education and Health meeting on the 19th of February. I'm going to suggest we also bring in item 9.13, which is the Department of or the Health Education Minister's response on the same issue to the same piece of correspondence. A couple of things I'd want to share. I mean, I would want to suggest that the health correspondence, that health response, I think it would be worth sharing that with the Education Minister and to ask him, particularly around the phrase that is used around, the details around the workforce that are available as allied health professionals. And I'd be keen to hear the Minister's assessment of the adequacy of that provision. And again, then arising from that, whether it is sustainable based on his response to maintain a position where we are engaged in a parallel workforce planning process with no timeline for completion. And I was really struck by that language. So I did note in the Health Minister's response, these allied health professionals, as we heard at our evidence session, are not just delivering services in schools, they are working as health professionals in the community, and they're often serving between sort of 50 to 70 schools at a time. It feels like a very big workload, and I would suggest it looks pretty stretched. So that would be my suggestion, to seek the Education Minister's response to those staffing numbers, but also to ask him to clarify, given those obvious pressures, how long this parallel workforce planning is sustainable. And I think that for me was the key thing that I took away from our concurrent meeting. Are members agreed, or do we have any other views on those pieces of correspondence? Agreed. Item 9.3 is correspondence from the Economy Committee regarding teacher demand model numbers. So I would simply suggest that we acknowledge receipt and would ask the committee to share the response that they received, that they get back from the department, if members are agreed. Item 9.4, page 252, it's a copy of a response from the Minister of Health on the removal of on-site nurses from special schools. It's an issue that has had significant attention here, so I don't propose to rehearse those issues. But I would simply ask, if it hasn't already been done, and I suspect it has, that we do just clearly note our interest with the Health Minister in that report and ask that it be provided to committee as soon as it is available. But I think that may well already have been done, but if members are agreed. Item 9.5, page 256, it's a response from the Department of Education regarding investment announced for outdoor equipment for schools. It addressed some of the committee concerns around schools not being able to carry that spend over into the new financial year, and there is assurance there that it can be, which I think is welcome. So I would suggest that probably just to note that we welcome that flexibility, but I think it's probably opportune now in the new financial year to seek an update from the Minister on the wider rollout of the curriculum capital programme that he announced, in terms of specific investment in areas such as PE, music, drama. So what's been allocated in this year, and when will schools start to see the benefit of that, and maybe some details on how that will be rolled out, if members are agreed. Are we agreed? Yep, I do need that agreement to be confirmed. So item 9.7, and I'd also just draw members' attention to item 9.20 in tabled papers. It looks, I didn't pay enough attention, looks like the same letter. There is a slight correction, I think a slight just drafting error. It is a slightly different version. So it is item 9.2, page 32, in tabled papers, apologies. It's a response from the Department of Education regarding details of the work the department has undertaken in response to recommendation 181 of the Gillen review. So again, happy to hear members' views, but I would propose to note, and just perhaps it is worth factoring that into the final outworkings of the committee's RSE report, and the committee may wish to take a position in that report if indeed we're confident that the Gillen recommendations have been fully implemented, or if that does need further attention, if members are agreed. Item 9.8, page 327, it's a response from the Department for Communities regarding upkeep of the listed buildings in the Middletown site, which Middletown Centre for Autism raised with us at our concurrent committee meeting there in February, and the response confirms some contact details of who the centre could contact for support in terms of that. I would propose that we note that there may still be issues that the Middletown wish to raise with us around the management of those buildings, but at this stage would suggest we share with them for any response, if members are agreed. Item 9.10, page 349, is a response from the Department of Education regarding after-school provision for children with special educational needs. It is a long piece of correspondence, so and it is detailed, and it's an issue that the committee has been interested in. I would maybe suggest at this stage we note, but I would encourage members to come back if there are issues arising from that correspondence, if we're agreed. Item 9.11, page 352, it's correspondence from the Committee for the Executive Office asking the committee to ascertain whether the Department of Education has any role in delivering the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy and if so, how much funding was bid for or earmarked in relation to that. I think we're clear the department absolutely does have a role, so I would suggest we put those questions to the department and share that correspondence. Are we agreed? Mm-hmm. Item 9.12, page 353, it's correspondence from Cubby. It's a private company seeking a meeting with the committee about the Cubby Sensory Hub, which some schools in Northern Ireland and I know in other jurisdictions have been using, and we did get an opportunity to see the Cubby in action at Bangor Academy, and it did seem to get a very positive review and feedback from the students there, and indeed the staff, who many of whom I think use it as well. But it is a commercial endeavour, and it may be that members would prefer to keep engagement with the EA about its pilot of those Cubby hubs. So I just want to check through the clerk what the status of that correspondence with the EA, where that is at. Have we had a full response from them on the outcome of the pilot?
I would have to check back.
Is that something we can bring back to the next meeting just to check? Because I think before we would agree any action, I would propose we do get full clarity from the EA on the outcome of their pilot, because that feels like the appropriate channel for committee to look at this issue if we're agreed. Item 9.13, page 354, is a response from the Department of Education regarding concerns that the provision of health services in schools are not fit for purpose, and the department indicates in their response it's a cross-cutting area. Joint education a health task and finish group has been established to develop detailed deliverable programmes, and they highlight that there's no agreement on timelines for the joint Education and Health Workforce Plan, and I'm just noting I think we actually picked that up earlier in our correspondence, so apologies, I've doubled up there. That's my own error, so content to note at this stage other than the agreed action. Item 9.14, page 356, response to from the Department of Education regarding its strategy for parental engagement and support for parents of children with SEN. The department refers to actions set out in the department's delivery plan published in February 25, which it indicates will be taken over the next 5 years, and it references some issues around the SEN first approach which has been raised by members in this committee. I would want to propose we note, but I would suggest that we closely monitor the delivery of the promised consultation on supernumerary admissions, and I'll certainly bring Danny in. I would want to make sure that we do see that rolled out, and if it isn't, to make inquiries around that, and also those parental engagement actions. But I'll bring Danny in.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I suppose the consultation, or if they're phased out approach, the removal of supernumerary. However, that part of it should be in tandem with what does a real SEN first approach mean, and I don't see it in this when it comes to placements. Again, this year we have the potential for children not to be placed at the same time as their peers, and my biggest fear is this is more words on a document and doesn't bring tangible changes to families and children with special educational needs. And we all know that a lot of children don't get their statements until they're already in school or in transition years. So for me, it's a very much an equality issue, and unfortunately it doesn't feel like to me that we're going down that approach of what I would deem to be a proper SEN first approach. It's really worrying.
Well, and I do agree, and I think the issue of the supernumerary admissions is only one element to it, and I think the correspondence does acknowledge that. Notwithstanding forward work programme pressures, which we will come to, I do think something the committee maybe needs to consider is, I think we all felt after our evidence session with the department on their delivery plan on SEN that there was just such a huge amount of information to process that it was hard to know even where to begin. It's such a massive area, and I think there may be an argument to say that we maybe need to bring the department back in bite-sized chunks around those planks of right place, right time, right people, right support, to really drill down into what that means. And I think this issue of SEN first is probably it's overarching for all of that, but it factors into some of those in a wee bit more detail. So that's something we can consider at forward work planning if members are agreed to leave it at that stage. Okay. Item 9.15, it's an ARC policy brief on understanding integrated school choice in a changing policy landscape, and an offer to brief the committee. As much as I would like to propose that they come and brief committee, because I noted one of the authors was Dirk Schubots, who briefed in the RSE inquiry and was a brilliant witness, and I think we all enjoyed his contributions. Not everybody agreed with everything Dirk had to say, but he was a very engaging witness. So I would suggest that we possibly keep that as a potential to factor in for forward work planning, even for an informal briefing should time permit. But I'm not sure in terms of our current context we would be able to facilitate that. But I would certainly want to write right to thank the for their approach. If members are agreed on this, yeah. Item 9.16 and 9.17, two separate pieces of correspondence inviting myself and the Deputy Chair, respectively, to an event in the Long Gallery to honour the work of the principal of the Buddy Bear Trust School in Dungannon. I understand that she is a Hungarian national, and this is an award being given to her by the Hungarian president or prime minister. I'm not sure of the structures. It's a Silver Cross of Merit, and I think it's quite a significant award. So I'm certainly happy to confirm that I will do my very best to attend assembly business permitting, and I would encourage other members to go along, because to all intents and purposes I think she's doing great work in that setting in Dungannon, if we're agreed to accept those invites. But I would just emphasise it's assembly business permitting, as it is a plenary day. Item 9.19 is a response from the Minister to the committee letter expressing concern at the possible pausing of the SEP programme, the School Enhancement Programme, in some schools, and it confirmed there is no pause, but there is a prioritisation of SEP projects in the special school space. So I would propose to note, but I think as this financial year progresses, the committee would want to keep a close eye on the SEP programme, because there are a lot of schools who have been waiting a very long time for that, if members are agreed. And item 9.21, apologies, this is a marathon on correspondence. It's a correspondence from the Department on the Interim Public Service Transformation Board, and it confirms that the Department of Finance is indeed seeking permission to reprofile the 600,000 that is potentially, was looking at it could be lost in this financial year, to allow the full 27 million allocation to be spent. It's not a clear assurance that the permission's been granted, so I would suggest we may want to write to the Department of Finance to just seek clarity on the outcome of that approach to Treasury, if members are agreed. We were all clear at our meeting on that. We certainly did not want that money to be lost. And item 9.22, correspondence from St Francis Primary Lurgan on a school crossing patrol. They have a very specific ask. We don't always get involved in taking up individual school issues, but they feel that the EA policy around school crossing patrols needs to be reviewed, and they're saying it doesn't reflect the specific context of the individual school providing, other than the immediate road context outside of it. They've highlighted very high pupil numbers, high ratio of SEND pupils, the fact that they have to deploy 10 staff for safe access and egress at every start and end of each school day. So would members be content that we do share that correspondence and ask the EA if they are considering a review of their policy on that specific point? If members are agreed. Agreed. And that is us at the end. Are members to content to dispose of the correspondence as per the summary note at page 169, other than those numerous exceptions, if members are agreed? Agreed. Okay, that takes us to item 10, which is Forward Work Programme. So that is the draft Forward Work Programme in its current form is at page 381. So I'll hand over to the clerk at this stage to speak to the Forward Work Programme, particularly in respect of now how we're going to manage the committee stage of the school uniforms bill. We've obviously had a decision that was passed in the Assembly of that stage running to the 30th of August now, rather than the longer stage that was originally agreed in the committee motion. So we probably do need to do a little bit of planning work, certainly an initial discussion on how we see the shape of that being delivered. So I'll pass over to the clerk to speak to that in the first instance.
Okay. So everyone, I don't have a silver bullet for this, but what I would say is that the best way to address it is to front load the committee stage, so that we can do as much as possible before the Assembly breaks for the summer, because obviously support and resource for additional meetings during the summer will have to be arranged, and is not yet. We've not sorted that out yet. So I would be interested in ascertaining when and how many additional meetings you might be able to have in your weekly schedule to hear evidence from stakeholders on the bill. The research report on the bill will be ready just after recess. The examiner for statutory rules will be able to come just after recess to the committee as well to advise on all of the subordinate powers in the bill. And Retail NI are already in, and provisionally we've got like a day for young people, a day for parents, a day for child rights activists. But I mean, there are other stakeholders that I would expect the committee would want to hear from. The Competitions and Markets Authority being a primary one. Child poverty representatives. I know that Save the Children and the Equality Commission have done some work on uniforms recently. I've spoken to the Youth Assembly team, and the Youth Assembly has already created several products on school uniforms, so they would be willing to come and have an appetite to come. And similarly, the Nikki Youth Panel have been in touch to say when can we come and talk about specific things that their panel have raised. School leaders and Board of Governors, I'm not sure what the best way is to reach out to them, perhaps through NEHT and ASCL. And then we're going to have the department come again, to clarify in between these meetings. So I would propose that to try to maintain the quality of scrutiny that we would wish for. After each evidence session, we might just recap whether there was anything that came up that gave members an appetite for amendment, and immediately advise the Bill Office of that so that they can begin to sketch out draft amendments for that. I don't expect that you know already what your appetite for amendment of the bill will be, but I think really front loading is the main thing that we can do to try to get a good grip on the bill early on, and then see how much more time we need and how many recess meetings you might require. Does that sound reasonable? Yeah.
Are we, the members, content with that? I was going to, from my initial discussions with the clerk, I think if after Easter recess, if we can come back with a draft forward work programme that has as many of those stakeholders penciled in on a provisional basis to get a sense of what that looks like. But I think, as the clerk has highlighted, there does need to be time built in between, because those stakeholders may raise issues that we need to clarify with the department. They may raise issues that require engagement with the Bills Office around amendments. So it's not a straight linear process from stakeholder to stakeholder, but I think as many of those as we can get in to see what that looks like. We did leave plenty of slack in June, so there is space in June, and again, if members have a feeling that they want to hold off on adding any further briefings in June, it will limit us in terms of engaging in any more detail around issues around special educational needs in particular, because I think there is an appetite to do that, but I would be reluctant to put any further briefings in at this stage if it means then that we're going to straight away be into scheduling summer meetings, which the clerk has highlighted could present some challenges. So, Danny?
Yeah, no, and you don't want to be impacting on vital issues like special educational needs. All I can say from my part is that, look, we'll work around the team as well, because I'm on the Justice Committee, but I'm quite happy to come in and do morning sessions and things. I'm fitted in, but I want to say this around the staff as well, because if we do have to come in around recess, it should not be on the timetable of any of the MLAs, to be honest. We should be doing it to make sure that we're accommodating the staff more than anything. So that means holidays have to go, then holidays have to go. It shouldn't be put on the staff, but willing to do whatever you need us to do.
Okay, any other members want to comment, David? Yeah.
Just because it would raise me, quite a few of us probably have never been through this process in terms, but in terms of when there has been more pressure towards the end of a mandate, there's been some indication to me that there's the ability to sit on sitting days if we need more capacity as well, whereby if we're needing the chamber, you can pop in and out, but actually there's the ability to do that, and I wonder whether it's worth looking at building in capacity of that then wouldn't impact as much on.
I think as the clerk has raised, we do need to get a sense of members' appetite to hold additional meetings in the week. Now, I would be looking at the Tuesday morning informal briefings as to whether that we could shift those to become formal sittings of the committee, because again, then that doesn't impact members' attendance at plenary. because I would be concerned that we could end up being in court if members are called into the Assembly chamber, and that just feels like a risk. And again, I think if we're bringing stakeholders in and then we can't make any decisions on the back of the evidence they've given us, I don't think that is a particularly good approach to be taking as a committee either. So I think if members are committing to additional meetings, I want to be very clear that I expect those meetings to be quorate, or there's no point scheduling them. So that I think that needs to be clear.
Briefings on legislation need to be quorate. You can't do them in an informal session, and they should be covered by Hansard. So Hansard will obviously have resource implications on a sitting day, but that's not to say that I won't put it to them and see, whether they can manage. And we have found before that with the youth stakeholders and parents, often the 5 to 7 in the evening is a good slot for them to come in. So we could, instead of having a stakeholder one, they could come in here. And
I mean, there's times we're in here anyway for, as you say, for plenary sittings. So if we knew it was scheduled in, I think that's something that we can all consider.
But I think again, I think to do it as an orderly way as we can. I don't think any of us want to be in a scenario where we have the atmosphere of the end of a mandate approach, where people are rushing around and squeezing things in just in the interest of getting it done. And that's an approach taken out of necessity at the end of mandate, and we're not in that space. So I do hope we can deal with this in an orderly way, but we will, I think, probably need to revisit this once we have a sense of how the forward work plan looks with those stakeholders built in, and then we can we'll probably at our first meeting after recess, once we see that, I think need to make a clear decision. So if members can take some time, look at their diaries, and I would want to be hearing clear preferences around: do we want it to be on a plenary day? Do we prefer it to be an evening setting? Or do we want to give up potential constituency days? So those are the questions that I think we need to be clear on. Got a very clear directive from the Minister. We all need to work harder. So let's see what that looks like for members. I'd be keen to hear that. I want to make sure we deliver a good committee stage. So I will need members at forward work planning. We can be a wee bit hands off. We'll just see what comes to us. I think we need to be quite clear now in terms of what it is we want to see on this if we're going to deliver it well.
Chair, I completely agree, especially with your last statement. I'd make 2 points. One is that I think we'd want to be looking at what we have in May and seeing, I wouldn't describe it as clearing the decks, but I would certainly be saying with the May sessions while we're here, unless it's absolutely mission critical, I would be looking at all those May sessions and seeing whether or not we can use those to try and expedite progress and scrutiny on this bill. The second point I would make is around stakeholder engagement and so forth. Now, I think the committee has to be cognizant of the fact that a very significant consultation was done on this just last year. It's not even old history; it's very, very recent, and I'm sure a lot of folks will have a lot of views on this. And in terms of best use of the committee's time, absolutely we'll have to take oral evidence. I have no question of that, and that's the right thing to do. I think we can also take written evidence in lieu of oral evidence. And so certainly my view on this will be, we will be having people in and we'll be doing sessions like we have today. But I don't necessarily think we have to have, 40, 50, whatever it is, stakeholders in and hear oral evidence. As we have noted on the RC inquiry, lots of that has come in as written evidence, and we've done that on the inquiry. This is a higher level bar. I accept that, but I think there is that provision for written evidence, and we do not need to see absolutely every stakeholder in front of this committee. But the key thing for me is, as we approach it, and I agree with you about trying to, tie it down and schedule it, the first obvious thing to me is looking at May and saying, what is mission critical in there in that forward work plan, and what could be taken out to facilitate getting good scrutiny on this bill?
Look at that 30th of April. We already have the research report scheduled to come in there. We probably need to do that first, and we have the EA in on operational aspects of SEND transformation. So I'm not going to propose we remove that. Again, do members have an appetite to drop the oral budget update? Is that something we're not interested in hearing from?
I don't think it's a question of not being interested, Chair. I know why I appreciate why you're contextualising it that way. I think it's about prioritising it. I think if we're going to be serious, and I am, about scrutinising the legislation in front of us, doing it in a timely fashion and not rushing it as we move towards the 30th of August, I think we just have to be realistic about what we can and cannot achieve. And the most obvious way of prioritising is looking at the stuff that we have in there and saying, is it mission critical or is it not?
Well, I'd propose members, maybe through the clerk, to highlight the items they're content to drop from the forward work plan, and then perhaps that's something we can factor into our first meeting after recess. I'm going to put down a clear marker from my perspective. I think it would be probably very bad faith to drop our concurrent meeting with the Economy Committee, as they have already put time and resource into that. So I think that is something that we should try to honour. Beyond that, happy to hear from members on that. So if I leave that for maybe after recess, and we can begin schedule.
Just make a wee point here, because I completely agree with everything you're saying there, because I see the point with stakeholders is, look, scrutiny's key here. We can't rush this. So if we have to give up the time, we have to give up the time and make the time. That's what we agreed to do. So if stakeholders want to come in, they should be able to come in, because that's so important. And listen, if we head towards, and I'm really sorry that it's going to happen to staff, but we agreed this, so we have to make sure we're working around the clock, and we have to sit here again, apologise to staff, the 12 o'clock at night, or work throughout to July, then we're going to have to do it.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. We'll see what the forward work plan looks like on the basis of that discussion after recess. But I really would genuinely encourage members, please do communicate with the clerk on this. But
I will proactively communicate with you.
Yes,
so you can communicate
so
back.
that is really, I think if there's one area where maybe you don't get the proactive communication, it is forward work planning. So please do that. That just takes us to item 11, which is any other business. I have none notified, so I will assume that is the case, and we will then move on to item 12, which is date, time and place of next meeting, and that's Wednesday the 30th of April, 2 p.m, room 29, and that leaves me to put the question that the committee meeting does now adjourn. Are we agreed?
Agreed. Committee room 29, sound.